Hello, folks. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Thank you all for being here on this such a beautiful day outside. I know it's difficult to get away from the tough weather. And for those of you who don't know, the Toronto Raptors did win the NBA championship. So kind of an exciting time. As you can see, we have some folks we're waiting for. I think they got held up in the parade. So I think we are going to move for a recess for about 10 minutes just to give them an opportunity to get back from that. So do we have a mover for a recess? Moved by Councillor Fulla, seconded by Councillor Klustra, and all those in favor. And that carries. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody, from the recess. I hope you got your refreshments and such. We're going to be moving on to an approval of the agenda, moved by Councillor Heen, seconded by Councillor Eamon. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you so much. Any disclosures of interest today? No, seeing none. Moving on. We have the minutes from May 27th, June 5th, and June 6th. Can I have a mover and a seconder for the minutes? Moved by Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor Sepola. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you. Smooth sailing so far. Closed session items, we have none today. And consent agenda, none as well. Moving on to board reports, we have the Affordable Housing Committee regarding the Constitution bylaw for the Affordable Housing Committee. So I'm not sure if somebody wants to start us off with this one, or maybe Cam or staff would like to start us off, and then we'll get a motion on the table and then open up discussion. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The City's Affordable Housing Committee has now been formed, and its first order of business has been to draft a constitution bylaw that contains the committee's terms of reference. The committee has considered the 14 recommendations from the City's 2010 Affordable Housing Action Plan, and the committee is here before you tonight to indicate that they'd like to focus on 8 of those recommendations, most notably making recommendations to Council with respect to offering municipal incentives for affordable housing, establishing an affordable housing reserve fund, identifying surplus lands for affordable housing, investigating the creation of transitional housing for youth, and alternative forms of housing such as tiny homes. The reason for paring down the terms of reference is to focus the committee's efforts on actionable and impactful changes that will create more affordable housing in Orillia. With that said, Council may at any time direct that the Affordable Housing Committee work on additional affordable housing initiatives that are not expressly covered in this terms of reference. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, just before we get into questions and discussion, let's get a motion on the table. You have one before you that this committee recommends to Council that is recommended in report AHC 1901 dated June 7th, 2019 from the Affordable Housing Committee. The Constitution for the City of Orillia Affordable Housing Committee be adopted as set out in Schedule A of the report, and that staff be directed to prepare a bylaw to adopt Chapter 99 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code Affordable Housing Committee. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Emond, seconded by Councillor Campbell. And now I will open the floor up for discussion or question. Councillor Emond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Jill, or I think is where I want to go. When you mentioned that one of the foci would be to recommend to Council on incentives, we've struggled over the last number of months, as you're well aware, about the incentives for shelters in our community. Would this, in the future, would this vehicle be the vehicle which would guide us in terms of having the ground rules and the principles by which we would then adjudicate requests of that nature coming to Council?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Currently, because we have no policy, those types of requests go directly to Council with no policy in place. So the goal would be to create a policy that would establish criteria for which types of projects you wish to support. That policy would be approved by Council, and then staff would review those requests and bring those requests forward through to Council, as opposed to individuals approaching Council directly, because there is no policy currently.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up on that, if I may. I understand what you're saying. At this point in time, I've felt that the staff function for affordable housing is part of the service we receive from the county through our contribution annual assessment for housing as part of social services in our community. So I have a two-part question here. Would something like the kind of request that comes from a group in Orillia that is starting something that would come, potentially has come to this council and we've had to deal, is that something that we could then at this table say, okay, now go back and coordinate with our affordable housing committee because their plans cover off all of the needs across that spectrum and to ensure that what you're planning to do fits and can be supported. And the second part of that is how does our Affordable Housing Committee then work with the county on the basis that much of the funding that we receive from the county is actually funding that is transferred from the province to the county as part of the county's role as the, what's the term? What are they mandated? The provider of social services for both the county or for the county and the two separated cities.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it would really depend on the policy criteria that the committee would want to recommend and have supported by council. So with that policy criteria, you could require that if the city is going to assist in any financial way, that there already be county funding or federal funding to support the affordable housing initiative, so that the city isn't going it alone. But it really depends on how the committee recommends to council what policy framework to support any financial endeavors. And really, once there's a policy in place, then staff can work with the applicants and the Affordable Housing Committee to make a recommendation through to council on whether or not that particular project warrants receipt of support.
Just a
Mr. Chair, if I can just conclude it sounds to me that we should go ahead with this, and that when you come back with the recommendations from the committee as to what the policy should be, that then we have a chance to delve a little more deeply into the subtleties that I'm trying to reflect here.
Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Eamon. I've got Councillor Lauer, then Councillor Spola, and then Councillor Follis. Councillor Lauer?
I'm having trouble looking at you through that hand. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was a member of the housing group that put these 14 recommendations together, so I'm a little protective of them. Certainly they were put together with quite a bit of consultation and a lot of thought over the last term of council. So I guess my first question is, I certainly understand that recommendation number 13 could be taken off the list because we've already done that, formed the committee in the way that we had suggested, and it looks like a great committee. But I'm just wondering what happens to the ones that have been taken off, that are not reflected in the terms of reference.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So again, council at any time could direct the committee to expand its work by asking us to specifically work on a task. So there is always that option available. And the items that were removed from the list really were not as tangible or impactful. And so we focused, because there's so much work, because there's no policy right now on affordable housing, there's so much work before this committee. So if this committee is able to accomplish those items that I mentioned in the opening remarks, then over time the terms of reference may need to be expanded and changed. But at this point in time, there's so much work before the committee that we're recommending that the focus of the committee be pared down.
And if I could, I appreciate how much work. I mean, the intention of the 14 recommendations was never to do this all at once, right? It was simply, this would be a nice series of objectives to have. And if you could, were offered the opportunity to advance any one of them, then you could take that, right? I'm just wondering, is there any way that these can be held in the background so that they're not lost, and that at some point when there's a reevaluation or a rewriting of one of these recommendations, that they can be taken into account?
Through you, Mr. Chair, certainly we have record of all of this work, and through the motions that were passed at council of the interest in having these 14 recommendations move forward. We do have that formally recorded.
Yeah, I guess where I'm going is, it seems to me that, as a matter of fact, it was you who brought it forward a long time ago, the one that ended up on the shelf. It was called an Affordable Housing Action Plan, I think, something like that, anyway. But it was there, and it existed, right? And that's what we used. Certainly, we brought it was good work, and we brought it out and pared it down from 34 to 14. So I get that. But I would like it to. I'd like to think that document still existed somewhere, that somebody could refer back to it, and it was known that it was there. anyway, I'll leave that one alone. My other question is simply along the lines of Ted's question in regards to incentives. And again, there's a lot of work contained in this terms of reference, and I'm just wondering, is there any way to make that a priority to come forward first? Because I think that's a very, very important, not only for affordable housing to get those things in place, but as far as a council, functioning as a council, I think it was a great way to sort that out and make some sense of it for the public, put a policy in place. So I don't know if that's just an
Sure, Cam.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I understand where you're going with this,
okay, sorry.
Councilor Lauer.
You've got at least a couple of months' work here. You've got it laid out, right? Okay, so I'm just saying, if I were to choose a first priority, I would identify the incentive, the municipal incentive objective as a primary goal. Now I realize that's just an opinion I'm expressing, but I think that's the most important to this council at this point.
Mr. Chair, just in consulting with our CAO, if that is a priority to this council, you can certainly make an amendment to indicate that so that the committee has that formal direction before them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So maybe Councillor Lauer, give that some thought if you do want to make that amendment a little bit later. Councillor Spola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Ms. Lewis and staff for the excellent job on this, and goes back to when you did the other master plan for affordable housing. And I want to thank the committee for including tiny homes. Councillor Follis and I have been working on tiny homes for almost 6 months now, I guess, and that. But one of the definitions of tiny house is a movement, it's known small house movement, as an architectural and social movement that advocates living in simply small homes, where it makes it affordable both for seniors and for first-time buyers, such as either newlyweds or single parents or whatever. And it makes it really affordable from all the work that we've done on it and that. So we're going to bring it to council in the future, so we're looking for a location in that. But my question is can that be one of the priorities that's set up here through the committee and through this council? Can we recommend to this council for that? Or do we have to do another master plan or master study that we did?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's no need for a master study or plan. But again, if council wants to make tiny homes the #1 priority, then you can certainly put that forward through an amendment.
Thank you.
So, Councillor Spola, it seems like an amendment will do. So I don't know if you and Councillor Lauer want to have a discussion. I know you have a difference of opinion on the priority, but feel free to bring that up a little bit later.
We'll leave it up to the committee, Mr. Chairman. If I may, my second question is the housing reserve. Are you recommending a certain amount? And maybe both you can comment. Is there an amount that would be satisfactory that we can recommend from this council, or amend the thing to say, okay, we need to put or recommend it to budget that a reserve be set up? Because I think this is really a very important issue in our community. And affordability of owning a home or living in an affordable home is becoming more and more restrictive, both to young people and to the elderly, and as Cam would know. So we really need to focus on this, on this, whether it's tiny homes or other venues that we can look at. So, can we go back and recommend, or would an amendment be in order here to recommend that this reserve be looked at budget time?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if this is supported, then the committee will do research and focus on determining what they feel is a correct amount in consultation with our treasurer to bring forward through a budget process. But it really needs to dovetail with the policy related to municipal incentives. They're two together, so you can't really advance one with the other. So it would be premature at this time to comment on any of those details, because there's much research that needs to be done.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll wait till some other councillors speak.
Councillor Fuller, always happy to come back. Councillor Follis.
Thanks. Through the chair, I wanted to say very excited by the intro of this new type of committee focusing on affordable housing, and honored to be a part of it along with Councillor Cipolla and Councillor Ainsworth. Just kind of a simple question posed to both or either of you. What do you think the greatest challenges will be with addressing some of the affordable housing issues in Orillia, and what do you envision some of the possible successes being? And I know Councillor Cipolla mentioned tiny homes. What do you think there's particular creative things that we can do to address some of those issues? I know that it's a very broad question, but I thought I'd send it out there. Thanks.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the challenge is going to be, quite frankly, funding it, but the greatest success is the ability to offer incentives to essentially, if the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal government can come together and all three sectors support affordable housing to lower the cost of construction, it will result in more affordable housing. But the challenge is having the funds to, where there's so many other competing priorities, is having the funds to dedicate to it.
Sure, Cam.
The other, through you, Mr. Chair, the other thing that we need to identify is need and where that need is. It's all fine and good to say we've got funding, we can do things, that are good, but I'll use the hub as an example. We know there's a need there. We know what it is. We know what we can do to help with the problem, and the problem is having enough. There's so many different types of affordable housing that are needed. And it's identifying which one is the one you have to tackle first. And that is, that can change. It can go, 6 months from now, it might be something different. So that's the challenge, to me anyway.
Thank you so much. Any further discussion before I hop back to Councillor Cipolla? Councillor Cipolla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor even said about incentives in that, but I'm just concerned that the incentives don't come just from our municipality, as was mentioned around the table. I think we really need to partner with the Ontario government in particular, and the federal government. They are coming to the table, my understanding, in the future with affordable homes, or with affordability, some kind of dollars for affordable homes to create them. So I'm just wondering, maybe through you to our mayor, if he's heard of any incentives that are coming from the province of Ontario for affordability, or our staff has.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Cipolla, any definitive plans? I know there's a federal affordable housing strategy which is being implemented. I'm not aware of anything for the province. The only thing I would add by way of interest is that I am getting together on a semi-regular basis and hope to fire something off to the Affordable Housing Committee in the near future with the former mayor of Midland, the mayor of Barrie, the former warden, the present warden, and myself, and to really think about outside the box on meaningful ways. And we're looking at examples of around the world where meaningful differences have been made in increasing the inventory of affordable housing at different levels. So that's not an incentive program, but there's some creative thinking going on and some creative research. So I'm hoping to have something for review by staff and by the Affordable Housing Committee. So,
thank you.
Perfect, folks. Any further questions or discussion? Seeing none, are there any amendments that were going to be brought forward? Councillor Lauer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will not bring forward an amendment at this time, but I'll talk to Jill and several others over the next week, and if I do amend anything, it'll be next Monday.
Okay, thank you so much, folks. And Councillor Cipolla, about the same boat, I recommend talking to Councillor Lauer. So with that being said, we've got the motion on the table. Would anyone like that reread? Perfect. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So folks, moving on, we are into councillor referrals. And item number 1, the Minister of Municipal Affairs regarding option by municipalities to implement a tax regarding transient accommodation. So maybe if staff, you'd like to start us off with this. I know you have a wonderful presentation for us. And then after that, we'll get into the motion on the table, and then we'll open up discussion and questions.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. With the extensive the legislation attached to this report, I thought it would be good to just walk through a quick slideshow to go over the legislation as well as the options being put forth for you guys to decide today. So Bill 127 was passed back in May of 2017 regarding municipal accommodation and transient accommodation. In December of 2017, the transient accommodation regulation came into effect, which provides the structure and regulations for a MAT. So the province has allowed municipalities to now tax transient accommodations, and this regulation is what basically governs municipalities if they choose to do so. A MAT can only be applied to a short-term rental, which is typically been 30 days or less, and only single lower tier and single tier municipalities can apply a MAT. So that means it really could apply a tax. However, a municipality, the county would not be able to apply the tax. Is referred to, we have it here as municipal accommodation tax versus a DMF. So if ever, in the past, some municipalities have adopted a destination marketing fee, which is very common in certain places such as Niagara Falls, Ottawa, Toronto used to have such a program. Those were voluntary programs initiated by municipalities, which were completely voluntary to both the consumer as well as the hotel or accommodator. In this case, a MAT would be accompanied by a bylaw and would be mandatory by all hotels, motels, and transit accommodations to enforce. Municipalities have the flexibility to determine the complete design of the tax. So that includes the tax rate, how much percentage the municipality would maintain, everything to do with the tax itself. And then HST would apply to the all-in price of the transient accommodation, including any MAT tax. So that would be appearing on the bill prior to HST being applied. There are some exemptions that are mandated by the province. So these will be properties owned by the Crown, all universities and colleges, post-secondary schools, hospitals, and long-term care homes. As well, municipalities are allowed to implement their own exclusions or exemptions to this tax if they wish to do so. And only the accommodation portion of the bill is applicable to a MAT. So if you're a family booking hotel room, their hotel room will be charged. Room service fees, food and beverage would not be applicable. And if you are an organization or a corporation who's renting facilities, including boardrooms, the boardrooms would not be MAT applicable. It would just be the actual accommodation that's attached to the bill. And as I mentioned, the MAT is enforced by a bylaw. In terms of what's mandated if you would implement the MAT, at least 50% of the net revenue must be shared with an eligible tourism entity. And the regulations define eligible tourism entity as a third-party nonprofit organization whose mandate is to promote tourism in Ontario or in the municipality. And I mentioned in there it says net revenue, so the regulations define it as you have your gross revenue minus any reasonable admin cost to implement the MAT. It gets you your net revenue, which then 50% gets shared. The collection portion of the MAT can be handled internally or outsourced externally. So municipalities have the option to do all the auditing and all the financial administration in-house, or they can hire a third-party organization to do it on their behalf. And then the remaining funds stay with the municipality, at which point it's up to the municipality in terms of how they want to spend those dollars. There are no restrictions placed by the province on how a municipality can spend those dollars. It is open for council to that direction. So as mentioned, eligible tourism entity is a nonprofit entity whose mandate includes promotion of tourism, and that's defined by the Municipal Act. And any amounts paid to this entity shall be used by the organization for the exclusive use of promoting and developing tourism. Once again, that's the box that the province dictates how that organization spends what they define as promoting and developing tourism, how those dollars are allocated. As long as the municipality and that organization are satisfied with the framework they come up with, it's open-ended. So there's no restriction in terms of it must go towards only advertising dollars. It can go towards overhead as well. So municipal accommodation tax, in terms of what the tax would apply to, they can apply to everything from hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, and in certain instances, short-term rentals as well. So your Airbnbs, Flipkey, and VRBO, for example. And as mentioned, only the accommodation portion can be charged. So in terms of gaining our research needed to put forth this report, we did consult with the industry. We provided 2 opportunities for the Orillia hotel industry to have their voices heard. So the first one was an information session held on February 15th of this year. We invited all the hotels, motels in the area. We had a working group established. Tourism Barrie attended via conference call to give their experience through the process and working with municipality, what they hope to accomplish, and that was a great opportunity for the for the hotel industry within Orillia to ask some questions. Following that up, we issued an online survey to all the hotels and motels within Orillia jurisdiction, and that was to get some information to be able to calculate our financial impact of this MAT if it was applicable. So we received an 83% response rate representing all of the hotel rooms. So 62%, you've seen a report, 62% of all hotels responded. Those 62% represented 83% of all rooms in the area. So we have a really good representation of the industry here in Orillia. Overall, the industry felt it would yield a positive impact on tourism. They really wanted to see a lot of dollars spent towards marketing and developing tourism within Orillia, and then hopefully helping them out raise their occupancy rates. Short-term rentals, as mentioned, they are applicable. Municipalities have begun to apply a MAT tax to short-term rentals in municipalities who have identified and determined how they will recognize short-term rentals. So Airbnb have gone as far as including MAT tax on their online booking form. So hotel Airbnbs who are registered with the municipality can then also be accounted for in the online booking system. So in terms of the report presented in front of you, I recommend that council future direction would be when the manager of legislative services comes back later in the summertime about how to handle short-term rentals in Orillia specifically. Some provincial examples. So in terms of assessing the landscape, 4% has been the standard across the province. Nearly there's been 19 municipalities who have implemented a MAT tax. 4% has been the standard. In terms of the percentage, what municipality holds back, the 50% has been the majority have gone with a 50% split. Different municipalities have had different amounts, and that was all on an individual basis. Other exemptions that have come up through the province, so shelters in the case of relief of the poor or for emergency, treatment centers, tent or trailer sites, accommodation supplied by employers to employees, as well as accommodations provided by an establishment that may or not contain a bed and is used for displaying merchandise. So if a hotel decides to use their boardroom for a certain reason to shelter people, those are excluded. So these are all different exclusions that have occurred across the province. Going into the options presented to council, the recommended options being put forth is a 4% MAT with implementation of April 6, 2020. That is giving us enough time to be able to work directly with all the hotels and motels in the area, have them prepared in terms of the accounting of the MAT tax, as well as working with our eligible tourism entity to come up with a marketing strategy to be able to spend the dollars wisely. We are recommending that Ontario's Lake Country receive 50% of the MAT revenue. Ontario's Lake Country has been the destination marketing organization for Orillia for the several years, and their ability to market has been widely respected across the county and the province. Ontario's Lake Country to collect and administer the MAT on behalf of the City of Orillia. So they have proposed an option at 2.5% of the gross MAT to be able to collect all the money, conduct all the auditing. So it would just be an in and out transaction for the City of Orillia. And then that staff was to report back to council biannually. So staff will report back twice a year with a state of the nation kind of update council how dollars are being spent, where they're going towards, what we're hearing from the hotels and motels, and be able to pivot if needed quickly, and also be able to take advantage of opportunities that come up. And finally, staff to report back to council during 2020 budget regarding the city's use of the MAT revenue. So that's the one piece that's not included in this report, and that would be how city council can spend the 50% that is withheld, or retained, I should say. So So finally, I mentioned Ontario's Lake Country is a destination marketing organization for the city. 2014 brand review established that Orillia was a key geographical reference for the brand, and as such have added Orillia and Aries four-season playground to all their marketing campaigns. They already have several private-public partnerships already built. They're working directly with all our tourism operators. They have access to additional leveraging dollars. So their 2018 operating budget was $220,000, and they managed to leverage that to over $400,000 worth of marketing spend. So they have partnerships already in place. Their board is comprised of several tourism industry leaders across the municipality. So they have the proper infrastructure in place to be able to really leverage these new dollars to tourism. Some highlights for OLC. So they received 712,000 page views from 310,000 visitors in 2018. They already have over 10,000 Facebook likes and reached over 4.7 million in 2018. So you can see the reach and abilities that they have already. 218,000 core funding, leveraged to 400. And finally, they have access to certain grants that municipalities do not have access to, such as Google ad grants. So they spent over $130,000 with Google over the past 20 months. The MAT use parameters. So OLC, we're looking at establishing a 3-year agreement with OLC to spend the MAT funding. And we would put forth an agreement that helps both city as well as OLC come up with a framework that best utilizes these funds. We're recommending such examples be 70% of total MAT funding be used strictly for Orillia-based partnerships and campaigns, so that'd be focusing on our waters, our events, just focusing on all Orillia items, and then 30% of the funding be allocated towards regional tourism development, with the understanding that the region has several assets that Orillia does not have, such as golfing, some of the trails, ski hills, things that people come to this region, use those assets and then spend their hotels, their food and beverage dollars in Orillia. So there is that regional focus that is inherent in this area. Finally, OLC, as you see, as they wrote a letter of support, or put forth a proposal to act as a designate for collection and administration of the MAT, and that's 2.5% of the gross MAT revenue, which equates to about $11,000 based off our current projections. So in comparison, the cost of developing a system within our own internal treasury department and the ongoing resources would far outweigh the $11,000 being put forth. Tourism Barrie have implemented this system using a third-party organization to collect, and so far, through their experiences, they highly recommend it. They're getting 2 audits per hotel per year. The third-party accounting firm has been able to work with hotels to make sure that the reporting structure meets code, and they're getting what they need from the agreement. And a 3-year agreement will be put forth between OLC and City of Orillia, and that would be the proper timeline to be able to assess and evaluate such a agreement. The first year will take just to collect all the dollars, and by the time you get to your second year, you'll start seeing the impact, which allows us to really evaluate within the 3rd year. City portion of the MAT, so as mentioned, 50% the city withholds. So a follow-up report will be presented to formulate different areas on how those dollars could be spent. Staff would advise on possible projects. So certain examples of what this province has spent these dollars on are sport event bid hosting, cultural event support, internal tourism marketing, tourism-related capital infrastructure, community live viewing events, and tourism investment attraction. So these are items that the city portion of the MAT could fund as opposed to the municipal tax base. So financial impact, the numbers associated with the MAT, overall projected revenue based off our current capacity would be $435,000 of new dollars to the City of Orillia. Once you less the $11,000 admin fee, we're left with about $425,000 of revenue for both the city and OLC. And with the 50-50 split, we're looking at about $212,000 retained by each organization. The City of Orillia currently provides $20,000 to OLC annually as part of the grant deputations. That $20,000 is being proposed to be saved from the city, as this funding would be in lieu of that operational grant. And finally, in conclusion, the opportunity to raise a MAT is something that the province implemented in place to be able to allow municipalities to find new revenue, be able to help support tourism industries, its operators, and its assets. Tourism is a key economic driver, and using a MAT would help augment tourism for Orillia. OLC over the past several years has proven itself to be very strong within Ontario, achieves high success, and is seen as a leader in the industry. And implementing a 4% MAT would be consistent across the province. At this point, I'd welcome any questions from council.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. Let's get our motion up before us here, just before we open the floor for discussion and such. We have a motion that this committee recommends to council that is recommended in report CCTD 1904, dated June 11th, 2019, from the Chief Administrative Office, a 4% municipal accommodation tax on all Orillia transient accommodations be approved and implemented date of April 6, 2020, with the exclusions set out in the report. And that Orillia's Lake Country, as the city's tourism entity defined in Regulation 43517, receive 50% of the net municipal accommodation tax as outlined in the conditions of the legislation, with staff authorized to negotiate an agreement regarding the parameters of use of the municipal accommodation tax funds, and that staff be authorized to negotiate an agreement with Ontario's Lake Country for the collection of the municipal tax accommodation tax on behalf of the city as set out in the report, and that staff report back to council committee biannually, including prior to the expiration of the agreement, to review the success of the municipal accommodation tax in Ontario's Lake Country and further application and collection of the municipal accommodation tax. And that staff be directed to prepare a report to policy which defines and guidelines how the municipality-related municipal accommodation tax funds be spent by the city, and report back to council as part of the 2020 budget, and that the mayor and clerk be authorized to execute all agreements regarding the municipal accommodation tax. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Heen, seconded by Mayor Clark, and we will open up the floor for discussion and questions. Councillor Iman, if you'd like to start us off, then I've got Councillor Spola, Councillor Heen, and Councillor Fallis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understood from your presentation, Michael, that we will be challenged to determine how we're going to deal with Airbnbs in our community sometime in the near future, so that they could be part of this if we assume a licensing model.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. So in speaking with the manager of legislative services, he noted that within the summer months, there'll be a report coming to council in terms of how to handle and address short-term rentals.
Yeah.
And within that report will be mention of the map being applicable to the short-term rentals.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Councillor Iman, is your mic on, just to double check?
Yeah, I turned it off because it was philosophical. I didn't. If it was practical, I'd have it on. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a tax for people who are using hotel rooms, right? And it says in the report somewhere that the primary beneficiaries of these kinds of taxes are the hotels and motels, the accommodation industry, the restaurant industry, and the retail industry in the communities. And I assume we only apply this tax to the accommodation because we can define them, as opposed to the restaurant business and the retail business, who get a lot of business. My concern comes not so much that there's parts of our tourism industries that are getting the advantage without having to participate in the gathering of this tax, but rather we have a number of significant businesses in this community who are province-wide in their focus, and have a large number of individuals who, for business purposes, visit our city not as tourists, but in order to undertake the business of that they're involved in. And I would suggest that the provincial police would be a perfect example. Hopefully Ontario Hydro or Hydro One will be an example in the future. And I'm just wondering if it is fair that we're setting up a tax that will be to the disadvantage of those businesses in locating in our community, and that they will be paying on behalf of their employees a premium in order to conduct business in our community. And I'm wondering how other communities who have confronted this particular issue have rationalized or have dealt with that issue.
All right, through Mr. Chair, I'll try to take a stab at that. So in terms of discussing other municipalities, that topic has not come up. In terms of businesses, organizations bringing tourists, in this case it'd be tourists to the area, would be similar to events in town, bringing people to town, regardless of what the business is. If we're hoping to be able to bring more and more to town, these dollars from this would allow us to do a better job of that, hosting more conferences and hosting more training opportunities through the hotels and associations.
And Councillor Heen, just on this particular point?
Yes, I attended a conference in Toronto, and Toronto had the same tax. And when I was attending on behalf of the city, and I asked the hotel if this was a voluntary tax, and explained that I was attending on behalf of my city council, and was told yes, it was a voluntary tax, and so I did not have to pay it. If I'd been attending as a tourist, then I had no problem paying it. But as I was attending on behalf of my city, I didn't feel it was fair to have my city paying for it, and it was taken off my bill. And perhaps the same sort of thing could be applied this way.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Heen. Councillor, SRF? Michael?
Do you want to go ahead?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, just as a follow-up to Councillor Eamon's question, in regards to other municipalities that are some pretty involved in conferences and large businesses such as Collingwood, Toronto, Mississauga, etc. These have not been included as an exemption for that type of business travel. So in terms of exemptions, we've kind of captured what's considered kind of the golden standard for Mississauga for the exemptions applied, and some that are Orillia specific, and certainly businesses have not been excluded in anything we've seen.
And then, through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of the voluntary side of it, I would be interested to know when the conference was, as it is enforced by a bylaw that they are mandatory. So Tourism Toronto may have been implementing a destination marketing fee, which is a DMF, which was the voluntary fee previously to the MAT.
Well, it had to be within the last 5 years because it was while I was on council.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Spola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important piece of paper for us to. Our economic driver here, and we don't have the factories that we used to have, and tourism is one of our key. We have 2 beautiful lakes. We have a beautiful city, and one of the things is we don't have enough funds to market without going to the taxpayers of this community. This will help us in promoting Orillia to Toronto, to, I guess, the rest of the world, hopefully. But I have a couple of concerns. One is that, and I'm prepared to move an amendment later once I've heard from everybody, is that I attended one of the conferences and had Ontario Lake Country, and a lot of people said, and I've discussed it with the two of you, is that nobody knew where Ontario Lake Country was. So my concern here is that somehow we have to get Orillia in there. So Orillia, an area, Ontario Lake Country, or Orillia, an area, Lake Country, whatever. So I think that's going to be a key factor in my supporting this, because of, and I don't want to predict what Mr. Ford is going to do with amalgamation or anything like that, but I think it's really important that Orillia be the #1 provider of tourism marketing and promotion within our community. So I have an amendment that I'd like to wait for a few minutes, and then I will propose it. My other question, Mr. Chair, if I may, is you have any amount paid to an eligible tourism identity shall be used by the eligible tourism identity for exclusive use of promoting and development tourists. So the way I read this, and the way I've talked to the legislation at Queen's Park, is that you're not allowed to use it for wages. So how do we overcome that, whether it's a thing for the city of Orillia, and my preference would be to have Tourism Orillia, obviously, rather than an outside, and the Lake Country does an excellent job, don't get me wrong. So how do we get around that? I mean, I think you said that it can be used for wages, and I'm not sure that's right, okay?
Sure, Michael.
Through Mr. Chair, I did have a conference call with the policymakers of this legislation through the province, and they did mention that there's no direct definition of what tourism promotion and development is, with the understanding that certain organizations may already be at capacity, so adding an extra $200,000 worth of marketing dollars would limit their abilities. So to your question, staffing is an eligible cost. They don't define any eligible or ineligible costs as long as the argument can be made that promotion and development of tourism in the area has been achieved.
Supplementary to that, Mr. Chairman. So if our share was 200 and some odd thousand to this new group, that whole 215,000 could be used for wages.
Through Mr. Chair, as noted, there would be an agreement in terms of the parameters of use for the MAT funding. Orillia, with Ontario's Lake Country, would come up with an agreement in terms of what we'd like to see out of the use of spending and what kind of deliverables we'd like to see. And as I said, we'll be reporting back biannually to be able to measure those deliverables.
Thank you. Can I go on, or do you want to? I'll
It
wait.
depends how long you're going to go on, Councillor Sabal. But no, maybe if you want to wait a
I
little
think you know
bit.
my passion in tourism. I'm a member of the RTO 7, but my passion
no
for
problem.
tourism.
And just to
it's
check,
a
have you
revenue creator.
Talk to staff about your amendment yet, just so that they have a heads up?
Yeah,
yes? Okay, perfect.
they have.
And then we're going to hop over to Councillor Heen and then Councillor Follis. And then I've got Councillor Lauer in queue and Mayor Clark. I think that was a hand there as well. Perfect. Councillor Heen.
Thank you. Sorry, I think you now know how the mayor feels at budget time when he has to read on and on and on, Councillor Ainsworth. Excuse me, I had a couple of questions. I think I heard you say that that some programs would be exempt. So, for instance, the Motel Chit program that is now sponsored by, say, the Salvation Army and the Victim Services Program, that would be exempt from this program. Did I hear you correctly on that?
Through Mr. Chair, that's correct. The exemptions being put forth is accommodation provided at shelter, and then accommodation provided by charitable, nonprofit, or corporations organized as shelters for the relief of the poor or for emergency.
And may I have one more question? Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the $212,414, I'm guessing probably is a lowball figure, because if the 47% occupancy rate, if we are as successful as we hope to be, then I presume that's a percentage growth or percentage occupancy over the whole year. That would increase, so that money would increase, so our amount would increase. So we can expect to have more than that amount of money that we could be receiving from it. But that would be correct?
Through Mr. Chair, yes, that would be correct. The hope would be that the outcome of this would be increased occupancy rates, as well as these numbers don't include any future growth in terms of hotels. So we know there's a hotel being permitted right now that doesn't include it, as well as any short-term rentals, which may or may not become included in the future.
And my last question, the $20,000 that they're receiving now, or that the Ontario Lake Country is receiving, would that go back into our grants budget, so we would have $20,000 more to give out to the community?
Councillor, and I believe that would probably be a decision that would come up for council of where to put those funds, but please correct me if I'm wrong, Michael.
Yes, those 20,000 would be saved from Ontario's Lake Country and be up for council on how to reinvest those dollars.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Moving on to Councillor Follis, and I've got Councillor Klustra, Councillor Lauer, and then Mayor Clark in the queue.
Thanks. Through the chair, just two quick questions. One was the OLC has suggested that it can act as a designate for the collection and administration of the tax. And I was wondering, are there other examples of them doing this in other municipalities? And, what are the drawbacks, benefits, and is there a cost associated? Thanks.
Through Mr. Chair, yes. So working with the City of Barrie and Tourism Barrie, it's the model that they've adopted at a 2% fee for Tourism Barrie with higher gross revenue. That 2% is actually closer to $25,000 in terms of the amount used. So far, the word back has been very positive from both the entities. Using a third party allows for a more hands-on approach, auditing systems, as well as it's easier system internally. So speaking of the Treasury Department, it'd be an in and out transaction to the city. We would be the recipient of the funding as opposed to having to administer it internally and taking up staff time.
Sorry, just supplemental there. So will the cost be the same as in Barrie?
Through Mr. Chair. So Ontario's Lake Country proposed a 2.5% fee, which is $11,000. So that would be taken off of the gross revenue to achieve our net revenue, which is then split 50-50.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Councillor Kalustra.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff. How many of our other neighboring municipalities have come on board with this program? Like has Orillia, Dante, Ramera, Rama, and Severn come on board for the 4% tax? I'm just questioning because if Casino Rama is part of the partnership and they're paying a 4% tax as accommodation tax, how do we gauge that if the casino is comping, say, 50% of their rooms and they do that like 365 days a year, and then there's no occupancy numbers that we would get to verify that number to say you only get 50%?
Through Mr. Chair, the first part of that question, so in terms of our neighboring municipalities, in speaking with staff, Orillia Dante Council have identified this. Staff is preparing a report. I'm not too sure yet which direction we recommended or how council will handle that. We did invite our neighboring municipalities to be a part of the working group for this function. In specific to Rama, I know Casino Rama has mentioned they're not eligible to apply this tax as they are on First Nations land, which is outside of these boundaries of the regulations here. So obviously, Casino Rama will be able to operate how they prefer with their rates. These funds would be used to promote Orillia and our hotels and motels and try and do our best ability to be able to market ourselves.
Supplemental. But also in the past, was Casino Rama not part of the Ontario's Lake Country promotional program already if they're not contributing to the tax?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Casino Rama do sit on the board of directors for Ontario's Lake Country, and they participate in all the different pay-to-play programs that OLC do operate in. So they are a partner at the board and believe in the work that OLC does.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Councillor Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going to the third bullet that reads, and that staff be authorized to negotiate an agreement with Ontario Lake Country for the collection of the municipal accommodation tax on behalf of the city as set out in this report. So within the report, there is a paragraph or a bullet that speaks to the parameters of that negotiation. And it specifically says 70% will be used for this, 30%, so on and so forth. Am I assuming that if that can't be agreed to, that it'll come back here?
I think, Mr. Chair, that is correct. So in terms of the parameters, those are two different agreements that we put in place. So the first one would be contracting out OLC to handle the collection, which would be one agreement. The second one would be the use of the funds. So coming up with that staff, and that's where we have the clerk and mayor to be able to execute those agreements. But yeah, so be working out that agreement in terms of how those dollars are spent. Okay,
and if there is a significant deviation, you'll come back here with...
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so if I could follow up. So I'm kind of in agreement with Ralph on this one. We're currently contributing $20,000, I believe it is, and suddenly we're going to ask the taxpayer of Orillia for an additional $400 and some thousand. Well, it's like a taxation, right? I think that ups the ante for us as far as identification and what exactly we want to get out of that. And so I'm more than willing to support any amendment that Ralph has that might speak to the idea of making this Orillia, or a little bit, the name Orillia a little bit more prominent. That aside, my last question has to do with the $212,000 that we're going to give to OLC. What kind of control do we have over that, and will we be able to say dictate that of the $140,000 that they're going to have to spend on Orillia-centric activities, that could we say we want you to contribute $30,000 to the OMA board for promotion, or to Mariposa? And what I'm trying to get at is currently we contribute quite a bit of money to both those organizations. And I'm just wondering if we can direct it through the OLC portion of the funds.
Through Mr. Chair, so yeah, the agreement can stipulate certain how we'd want to spend some dollars. In terms of control of the dollars, City really do have one designate on the OLC's board of directors, which is manager of tourism, myself. So sitting on the board, as well as several of the board members are industry people here in Orillia, so they have a bit of that control there. As well as part of the proposal, OLC did put forth a proposal in terms of establishing an advisory group in terms of how those dollars are spent. So OLC is open to having additional advisory members in terms of the dollars spent. And then lastly, in terms of working with the industry, the industry have established that they'd like to see, obviously, new dollars being spent and be able to further enhance the current complement of tourism dollars currently already established.
Oh, sorry, that's rough.
To you, Mr. Chair, just to add to that as well, there is also the 50% that the municipality would be responsible for. So there is the portion that the City of Orillia would come back to council to provide some recommendations. Certainly, Ontario's Lake Country being a destination marketing organization, their strength is in marketing and advertising and really promoting Orillia as a destination. So certainly, what we've heard back from the industry is that there is that desire and expectation that the dollars that are coming from this municipal accommodation tax go towards that enhanced marketing for making Orillia a much more attractive tourism destination. But certainly that 50% that Orillia retains, we can determine, our council can determine how they want to spend those dollars.
Thank you so much. Mayor Clark?
Thank you, and through you, I guess, to anybody who cares to listen. A couple things. One is with respect to Councillor Sapola's question about the name. I do subscribe to his theory that I believe the brand could be stronger and more identifiable if Orillia's name was more prominent. So I'm hoping that with such an increase in contribution in terms of dollars and percentage, that maybe they're amenable to looking at something that does that while still identifying the benefit of being situated or associated with the surrounding area. And I just do want to be clear that this is not something that the taxpayers of Orillia would be paying. And matter of fact, I think they'd be the last ones that would ever have to. It would certainly be the people that would be visiting the community. And I would like to recommend. Or commend rather the staff for putting this together. I am quite comfortable with. I had a few questions that I've had answered. The stakeholder consultation opportunities seem to have been wholesome and well taken advantage of. There was a couple of municipalities that decided not to come to this particular table. The buy-in from the Hotel Association was 62% of the respondents, representing I think 83% of the rooms out there being in favor with the condition that they felt some benefit at some point. I thought was a significant indication of a strong consultation. I also believe that as a member of council, I'm always looking for ways of not duplicating, of enjoying synergies. And I think this does that. I think the 50-50 split at the municipality at our new high energy department will have some ability to run some programs or tourism info, whatever it happens to be, that complement the work that Ontario's Lake Country does do for us in terms of marketing. I think will be great. And I do say, that I believe that Ontario's Lake Country OLC does do a very good job of marketing. So I'm quite comfortable with that relationship continuing, using them as our as the continued that DMO as the gathering agency, the marketing agency, and the auditing agency, which I think is a benefit to the city. I'm not in favor of the MSC or the Municipal Service Corporation. I guess that's really it. I will be supporting this and wait the subsequent report, which will put a little more vegetarian meat on the bones. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor Clark. Any further discussion? Councillor Spola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to our staff, you've looked at why or how come the city of Orillia, because I go back to some of the research, 48% occupancy rate within the city of Orillia, if I understand correctly. So that's that's low. That's lower than most municipalities. So I think by doing this, we will increase that occupancy, and as I discussed with you too, about talking to some of the hoteliers to somewhere, if it's done right, and I'm sure it will be, to over 60%, 65, even 70, 71%, 75%, which off-season, off the shoulder season, is really where we need the help. Okay? So my question to you is, why wouldn't we consider, instead of having an outside agency, and Orillia Country, or Ontario's Lake Country is part of our city, there's no question about it, why not form Orillia Tourism and do it as a separate nonprofit organization and have it do the work for Orillia and an area rather than Ontario Lake Country?
Through Mr. Chair, in terms of Ontario's Lake Country, they already have established budget of $200,000, which they've already leveraged to $400,000. So utilizing them as our third-party entity, we'd be able to leverage them even further. The partnership that they've already built with all of the ski hills and the golf courses and all the different partnerships in place, they have packaging already. These dollars would really be able to just hit the ground running immediately and just start leveraging everything already being done for the area. And their board of directors, they have really strong board of directors with industry experts already on board. So really these dollars would just be able to help fast track a lot of the programs in place and really just leverage dollars that are already currently being leveraged with the county and the province as well.
Supplementary to that for our CAO, I wonder if we could consider forming a tourism committee of council to help Orillia area, Lake Country, market this so that we can have some input with, we have excellent staff on the tourism thing. Would you consider us being able to do that as a tourism committee of council?
Sure, Madam CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chair, currently the tourism portfolio is managed through the manager of tourism. If Councillor Sapola would like Council to consider the establishment of a committee, then I would suggest that perhaps through an inquiry process, he bring that forward and staff can report on what the mandate of that type of committee would be and the composition.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Heen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a little over 30 years ago, we did have a tourism Orillia when Councillor Riemann was mayor of Orillia, and he may remember that particular committee. I remember because I was actually hired by Tourism Orillia, and it had an office on the main street. But I'm wondering if we might be recreating the wheel, and if we might get more bang for our buck with Ontario Lake Country, and perhaps Councillor Eamon could speak to what he remembers of Tourism Orillia back then.
Councillor Iman, if you'd like to respond, that's fine. If not, that is okay as well. It's up to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate my colleagues probing my memory, which at the moment is completely blank. I can tell you what I had for dinner last evening, if you're interested. But to be quite candid, Pat, I can't remember the specifics of it, but if it was done under my term, they would have been awesome.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your modesty, Councillor Emond. Any further discussion around the table?
Mr. Chair, if I can have the amendment, I have a seconder for the amendment. That would be great.
Sure. Let's get that up here. So we have amendment to before us that the motion now before committee be amended by adding the following after the second paragraph, and that as a condition of receiving the city's municipal accommodation tax funding, Ontario's Lake Country be required to include Orillia as a primary geographic reference in the organization's name. And we've got a mover with Councillor Sapola, and we still have a seconder with Councillor Lauer. We do.
So if I can speak on it,
the floor for discussion. Councillor Sapola, if you'd like to start us off.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the rest of council would agree to having it Orillia's Lake Country, Orillian area Lake Country, sorry. If that would be
Sure,
a better amendment.
Mayor Clark, if you'd like to start us off on that one, and I see Councillor Follis as well.
Thank you. Although some may think and believe, and maybe rightfully so, that this additional monies that will be going to Lake Country may give us some leverage, that may very well be, but I'm not personally in favor of telling a partner what their mandated name change is going to be. I'm not opposed to having a conversation with them, and there may be productive conversation that comes from that goes in this direction. I do have a question, if I could, through you, Mr. Chair, specifically on this. The report that staff will be bringing back, presumably in the fall, because my inclination is to wait until that report comes back and then decide whether we want to go in this direction. Because I do, as I mentioned earlier, I do agree with the overall concept. But there are a number of things that will probably settle over the next number of months. And I'm just wondering if I could have a response from staff on whether waiting on this kind of thing until the fall has any negative repercussions.
Through Mr. Chair, so the report would be for the obviously the budget of in terms of how the dollars be spent. They're working with the partners. OLC would not want to know, but it'd be helpful as they're setting their budget for future years, and then also just the implementation. So in terms of waiting to.
Sorry, I'm just specifically asking if there's a negative repercussion of waiting on this particular amendment. Delaying the amendment until the fall.
Madam CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the way I read this amendment is this entire process having Lake Country act as our representative is contingent on them adding Orillia to their name. And so staff will be moving ahead with the direction of council once this issue has been adopted by council under the auspices of the actual motion. And so waiting to the fall and then adding this condition as part of that could certainly cause some challenges. So I think if this is going to be a condition of having Lake Country be our representative, then it's better to deal with that now as opposed to in the fall when we've already negotiated agreements and such.
If I could respond.
Thank you so much, Madam CEO. Sure, Mayor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I apologize. I missed part of the meaning of this amendment in that it makes your response germane to my original question because we only approved this on a condition of that. So I'm not sure if I'm in favor of making it a condition. So I guess my question to staff would be, do we lose any ability to have these conversations and maybe get a name change if we approve the DMO running the program and waiting on this particular name amendment without the word condition in it until the fall? Or is that something, if we're going to contemplate it, does it need to be contemplated now? End of story.
Sure, Ms. Ruff.
Through Mayor Clark, certainly I think as the CIO indicated, if it is a condition that council only wants to support this if Orillia is in the name, then it should be addressed now. Certainly if it's just staff direction to have those conversations with Ontario's Lake Country. I know certainly this has come up before in their rebranding exercise in 2014. There has been the feedback that Orillia really is the geographic marker for Ontario's Lake Country. Certainly we can have those discussions, but in terms of whether or not it would be a condition of would be determined by motion. So certainly we can have those conversations with Ontario's Lake Country and hope that they would include it, but it wouldn't be imperative that they include it based on being the entity for the MAT.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chair, if I could just, I think I can rephrase my question and so that I can go and be quiet for a while. But do you see a downside to including this provision? And that's directed to staff, Mr. Chair.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, it's tough to predict the future. Certainly, we have had those initial kind of mentions of that discussion on Ontario's Lake Country. However, we don't have an indication of exactly how it will be received. Certainly, if this was a condition and it wasn't met, we would come back to council at a later date with further options. One of those options potentially is it goes back to status quo as Ontario's Lake Country as the tourism entity, or other alternatives. So certainly, if this wasn't met, we'd be coming back to council with further options at a later date.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I've got Councillor Follis, Councillor Heen, Councillor Lauer, and then Councillor Emond on this particular amendment.
Thanks. Through the chair, I'd like to submit for consideration Ontario's Sunshine Country. I thought that'd be a good one. I like the intention of this, but I think I agree with Mayor Clark in that forcing a name change might be a bit much. I wondered, is there a way of changing the wording of this particular amendment so that, as we're discussing, look at considering the possibilities of doing it through discussion?
Councillor Follis, there's definitely a way to do that. It's the amendment to the amendment, if you'd like to go down that road just for further consideration.
Would anyone be willing to support me on that?
That looks like a no, Councillor Follis.
Sorry, just I guess for clarity,
Sure.
To propose an amendment to this amendment, basically saying that we'll reach out to Ontario's Lake Country to work with them to amend the name, essentially. It doesn't have to be that name. I was just joking, as an informal submission, I guess. Without. Sorry, through the chair. With this amendment to the amendment, although we don't have the phrasing yet, is anyone interested in supporting this change?
Mayor Clark?
Sorry, on this, I am interested in the direction you're speaking about, Councillor Follis, wholeheartedly interested. But I believe that wouldn't be an amendment to this amendment. I believe it would be a desire to defeat this amendment and bring forward a new amendment. But I would ask for direction from staff. Madam CEO?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would agree with Mayor Clark in the sense that the issue I believe I'm hearing from Councillor Follis is the fact that he is not looking for this process to be conditional. He's basically suggesting that a discussion occur with Lake Country considering adding Orillia. And so I believe, and certainly up to you, Mr. Chair, but I believe considering the name change versus as a condition of is substantially different, and consequently Mayor Clark is in my opinion correct in the sense that you would want to defeat this motion and an alternative motion would come forward that would see it as a sort of a softer approach.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Madam CEO. So, Councillor Follis, I would see that as an alternative motion, just to clarify that for you. Councillor Heen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, do you see the other members that sit on Ontario's Lake Country as being at all receptive to this name change, or do you think that it would be met with a lot of opposition?
Through Mr. Chair, as reference back to the 2014 brand review, so it really was, as mentioned, identified as that recognizable geographic point. So this topic has come up quite a bit over the last, say, 10 years in terms of the board knowing not to be able to speak on behalf of any other board members at OLC. It has been a topic of conversation, so it would be something that's not new to them. It is something that they're aware of exists, especially coming from that brand review.
The one good thing about it is that the initials wouldn't change, so it would still be OLC, so that might be a positive.
Thank you so much, Councillor Heen. We've got Councillor Lauer and then Councillor Imont in queue, and then I think I see Councillor Spoll as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I understand it, this is an ongoing negotiation. We're going to be talking about the 70%, 30%, and that's not etched in stone. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I didn't see the amendment before it was presented on the board, and I also am a bit sensitive to the fact of telling somebody what they're going to do, but I am in favor of telling somebody that we are negotiating, and I like to have a little punch there as well. So I would be more in favor of adding this to the parameters of the deal negotiation. And if they're receptive to it, it sounds like they've talked about it before, and certainly I would think our partners, realizing that we are probably going to be contributing 10 times more than they are to this initiative, may be receptive as well, and that if indeed they are receptive, then fine, carry on. If not, then maybe that would require, as I said before, if there's something that they're not agreeing to, that it could come back to us for a yes or a no, or carry on or don't. So I would be in favor of that kind of a process as opposed to just trying to ram it down somebody's throat. So however that would have to happen, and I would support that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Lauer, Councillor Imont, and then Councillor Spoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not in favor of this amendment. I do believe that OLC needs to do a fair bit more thinking around the implications of taking this on, because all of a sudden they're going to have 80% of their funding will be coming from the city of Orillia, as opposed to 20,000 out of 200,000. That would suggest that taxation without representation would require us to have 80% of the board and related things of that nature. So my belief is that the implications of this from their point of view have not been fully thought through yet, either administratively at OLC nor amongst the partner organizations, and that those discussions would be delicate and not enhanced by our imposing at this point in time a requirement of this nature. Secondly, we do know that municipal reorganization is potentially in the agenda of our province, and sometime in the next 6 months to a year, we will have a sense of where that's going, which may make this problematic with respect to what agency represents what part of our province and so on and so forth. So, but I do believe in the short term, as you sit down with OLC, we need to raise questions with them about the implications of a significant shift in the funding model that is taking place here, and what that means for the other agencies.
Thank you so much, Councillor Eamon. Councillor Cipolla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This addendum does exactly what I think everybody's talking about. It's a condition, and if once our staff has an opportunity to negotiate with them and everything else, if they come back and say, no, we don't want to do it, then it comes back to council, and then council can make another decision saying, yeah, okay, we'll go along with it or whatever. Because the 400 and some odd thousand that's being contributed, I'm guessing that about 99% of it comes from Orillia, because we're the only ones that really have the hotels, other than Rama, the casino, and obviously they are not going to charge the 4%. So I'm not sure why, if you're giving almost 100% of the funds to operate and promote Orillia and promote the area, why they would. But anyways, I think the addendum makes exactly what you're trying to do. So I guess maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Once you negotiate and they say yes or no, and then it comes back to here and say yes, they've accepted it, no, they haven't accepted it, and then we can go from there. This council can make that decision at a later date.
Madam CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I may, and certainly if staff have anything further to add, what this amendment actually does is it makes it a condition. So it's important to recognize that if that condition's not met, then this issue, depending on what comes back, could be a reconsideration, or it may not be, depending on how it comes back. But at this point in time, it's very clear that as this amendment is worded, it is a condition that Lake Country consider, or Lake Country include Orillia as the primary geographic area in their name. So I just want to make sure that that we're clear on that. That if they do not, then absolutely staff will have to come back. But whether it will be deemed a reconsideration of the overall issue will be determined at that time.
Perfect. Thank you, Madam
Just
CEO.
clarification,
Councillor
Mr. Chairman, if I
Cipolla.
may, to staff. So am I correct in saying that almost 97%, 98% comes from the city of Orillia for the 412,000? Because there's no hotels anywhere else.
From the MAT revenue?
Yes.
Yeah, that would be, these are really hotel motels. We can only enforce the bylaw within our jurisdiction.
Correct. Thank you.
Councillor Lauer.
Thank you. Just in an effort to move things along, I wonder if it's possible that the mover of this amendment and the seconder, did I officially a second? I did. Withdrew this amendment at this particular time and brought it back next week.
Councillor Lauer, it's already on the floor, so there's no way to pull that back.
No
it
way.
would be, defeat it.
So we have to go through the amendment. So I would ask through you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I may just assist, we're in committee. So if it's lost in committee, it's fine. If somebody wanted to raise it next week as an amendment to the main motion as part of a council process, they could do so. So it could be defeated and then brought back at another time. There's no reconsideration issues when we're in committee.
Oh, okay, so that works then, right?
Perfect. Hopefully that clarifies. Mayor Clark?
Thank you. Just to be clear on the money front, yes, the taxes or the revenue raised through this MET would be almost solely, if not solely, well, be solely properties within Orillia. But that's not 50% of that money comes back to the city directly for our new department, and then 50% goes to Lake Country. So they're only getting 50%, and that's of a larger pie than the 212,000 last year. I think was leveraged into about $400,000. So. It is a lion's share that really will be contributing, but there's still a significant contribution from other agencies. If I could, Mr. Chair, just like Councillor Cipolla, I would recommend that maybe this, if you're satisfied, it's been discussed that we call it potentially defeat it. That would be my recommendation, and then propose another amendment.
Councillor Cipolla?
Thank you. I would hope that council would not defeat this. This is a really important issue for our community to go ahead. Whether we use that money to build a skate trail or whatever the heck it is, that's a tourism attraction within the city of Orillia. So I hope you don't defeat this, because I really am serious about having the word Orillia in there. Orillian area, I don't care, but I think the word Orillia needs to be in there.
Perfect. Thank you, Councillor Cipolla. Just looking to my colleagues, I would like to make a comment on this. I'd be happy to switch with Councillor Klustra, or in order to speed things up, if you're okay with me staying up here. Okay, perfect. Well, with that being said, I will not be supporting this amendment moving forward. I believe that it would really just stop this whole process. I think when you tell somebody that they need to change their name, especially when they have a board of directors and such, not very receptive to that. And I think personally it would derail the whole motion that's coming forward, and I will save my comments for the motion till we get to that point. So with that being said, any further discussion around the table? Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment? And that is lost. So folks, going back to the original motion, I know there was some discussion around potentially another amendment coming on the table. Is that something that is moving forward? Sure, Councillor Fallis.
Through the chair, I guess maybe a question of the clerks. Would it be best to develop something for next week, or is it best to draft something up spur of the moment?
Councillor Fallis, just on that point, I think that would really be up to folks who wanted to move the amendment, if they were set on moving that today, or if they wanted to wait till the next council meeting. I see Councillor Lauer has his hand up there, so maybe we'll go to him on this point.
To Councillor Ainsworth, well, I'm committed to finding some sort of solution, so I think probably it makes more sense to give ourselves a bit of time and talk to the people who know, and maybe come up with something.
Sure, I'm happy with that.
Okay, Madam CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just in terms of timeframes, just so members of council are aware, there is a board meeting, from what I understand, with Lake Country in July. And staff, as a sort of course of action, would have the discussion with the board of directors with Lake Country. However, if council is looking for them to add that specifically on their agenda as a request from council, then you would want to do an amendment to the motion to provide that directive. And at this point, we do have a draft motion that would amend your main motion that would look at having Lake Country be requested to consider. So certainly can be dealt with at this meeting, Mr. Chair, or if members of council want a little bit more time to consider, something could be brought forward next week at council.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Madam CEO. So folks, with that being said, there is a proposed potential amendment here. If folks would like to bring that forward tonight, we can do that. Or if you'd like to wait till next week, you have that opportunity as well. So just looking for some direction around the table if we'd like to do that now. If there's a mover and a seconder, if not, can wait till next week, or we can just not have one at all.
Who proposed the motion? Sorry.
There is no proposed amendment at this point, Councillor Pola. It's just a discussion around the table. We do not have a mover or a seconder yet, but the potential amendment that folks could consider around the table is the one that's on your screen that reads, and that Ontario's Lake Country be requested to consider including Orillia as a primary geographic reference in the organization's name. Councillor Pola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be prepared to move it. I better get something better than nothing, so this is appropriate.
Okay, so with that being said, we do have a mover for this proposed amendment. Do we have a seconder around the table? Seeing none. Oh, Mayor Clark.
No, I was just going to, sorry, you haven't called the question. I just want to make sure I'm not moving a wrecking process here. I was just going to say I'm actually more comfortable waiting until we have a chance with staff and potentially bringing this forward next Monday, that's all.
Okay, fair enough. So it seems like you may have a seconder next week, Councillor Spolis. With that being said, there's no amendment on the table. Any further amendments that folks would like to discuss? No? Perfect. We'll move back to the original motion as presented. Would anyone like it reread? It is on your screen. No? Perfect. Well, all those in favor of the motion? And that is carried. And thank you to staff for that thorough discussion. So folks, moving on to our next item, item number 2, Deputy Clerk, regarding overview of cross connection and backflow prevention program. And we have Mr. Shell with us. Mr. Shell, if you'd like to maybe start us off, and then we'll get a motion on the table, then open up the floor for discussion and questions.
Certainly. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mitchell, who actually is the author of this report, unfortunately is away due to illness today, so I'll be presenting. The purpose of this report is to provide an overview of the annual cross-connection and backflow prevention program in regards to inspection fees and the frequency for ICI properties. The city administers the program and relies on private contractors referred to as qualified persons to carry out the program requirements. The program is virtually a two-phase process with applicable fees that would apply. The first phase is the initial cross-connection inspection report, which determines the type of backflow device that needs to be installed in each premise. And then, once approved, the installation of that backflow device. This is virtually a one-time setup that is required to be compliant with the initial phase of the program. The second phase is conducting the annual maintenance of the device. These devices are mechanical in nature and require annual testing to ensure correct operation. That really is the basis of our backflow prevention program. We also have fire hydrant maintenance and operation that also requires backflow and annual inspections. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shell. Before we get into discussion and such, we have a motion before us that this committee recommends to Council that report ESO 1906, dated June 4th, 2019, from the Environmental Services and Operations Department regarding an overview of the annual cross connection and backflow prevention program be received as information. Do we have a mover for this motion? Moved by Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor Heen. And we'll open up the floor for discussion or questions. Councillor Heen, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was curious, where do we have private water hydrants? I don't think I've ever seen one because they're painted a different color.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Any piece of property, like a larger development, has private hydrants within the fire department requires hydrants. So a larger development in regards to an apartment building would potentially have private fire hydrants that they maintain on their own.
So supplementary. So do you mean that, like, also the large townhouse developments, like condominiums, ones like where Councillor Eamon lives, would they be private hydrants? Because they're, or where Lucy Lane is, would they be private hydrants?
Typically, those hydrants are maintained by the actual condominium developments.
Okay, and my second question around that is, why, if they can control the water usage out of the public ones, why can't they out of the private ones?
Sorry, could you?
It said in the report that they couldn't control the water usage if they had to use those hydrants. So if they can control them out of the public ones, why can't the hydrants be built so that they can control them out of the private ones?
Okay, so
I'm sorry, I should have asked you that question earlier, and I usually do, as you know.
Right.
So
the whole premise of the backflow and cross connection program is as the water purveyor, we actually look after the distribution system. Ultimately, the distribution system is anything that is on the city property and that we can control. Ultimately, we have regulations that control the public side of the property, and we know that we can maintain compliance with our requirements of our licensing by looking after the public hydrants. The actual private side of the business is more of a challenge for us because we are actually not doing any work on the private side. So people can come into the private side of the property and do whatever they wish to. So ultimately, we try to put in our bylaw to ensure that anybody that is using private hydrants are actually maintaining them and using them the way that we would as well.
Sure, Councillor Heen, last question.
So if there was a fire in the private ones, how would we assess for that water usage?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we don't assess the usage for a private fire hydrant if it was a fire, nor do we for the fire department on the municipal side. We only ask for water usage when they're actually doing the testing of those devices.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mr. Schell. Councillor Cipolla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. I've had some phone calls on this. One of the questions was if a retailer, I don't have water in my place, it's part of the plaza, so I'm no longer involved with it, so I don't have a conflict. But the retailers are saying, we only use the washroom. Why do we need this backflow inspected every year? One of the things a lot of municipalities are going to is categories, where if you own a restaurant, yes, every year, excuse my pun, Mr. Mayor, every year you need to do it because you have a dishwasher and chemicals that are put into that dishwasher. But I'll give you an example. Hearing aid inspector or whatever it is that you go to have your hearing aid done has to have a backflow inspection, and it's $150, $200 a year. When I owned the plaza, it was $650 a year plus. So, and because we had a restaurant in there, I didn't mind paying it because there are environmental sensitive chemicals go in there. So can we consider having categories where a retailer that only has a washroom and a wash basin, or compared to a restaurant or a hospital or whatever? So can we consider that as part of this motion?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Again, as the water purveyor and trying to make sure our municipal water is safe at all times, we implemented the cross-connection control program, which is even for residential. We have backflow devices on all residential, all commercial, and all industrial properties. The reason being is we cannot control what happens on the private side of the business. We can control what's on the municipal side. So ultimately, what we've done, as per the Walkerton inquiry and the requirements through InfraGuide and CAN CSA, the B64 standards, we have gone with a program that follows that. It removes our liability as a city to have contamination come back into the actual water system. One of the things with CAN CSA B64 is it's very strict when it comes to cross connections and how they assess cross connections. Minor hazard, for instance, which we consider residential, says with no possibility of any health hazard. Moderate hazard is any minor hazard, which says no issue with health hazard, that has a low probability of becoming a severe hazard. The way we look at it, and as CAN CSA B64 look at it, is any commercial property is considered a moderate hazard because they have more public coming in. They do not have the control of who is actually using the system and what people may be doing in that system. Therefore, when we did this program, instead of trying to understand all the different types of issues that are out there, we went with a standard that said all commercial properties will have moderate to severe hazards. That way, they are looking after the program. We are not administering a program which would create even far greater costs because you're trying to administer a program that is so diverse. So that in that situation, we went with a very standard, which we felt was efficient program, and it put the onus on the actual property owners to ensure that compliance is met.
Supplementary, if I may, Mr. Chairman. So the risk factor is what you consider, correct? So why can't we have the inspection on the non-risk factors, such as your residential and a retail that doesn't have anything other than just a washroom and a wash basin, inspected every 3 years or every 2 years or whatever? I totally agree that they should be inspected, but having that cost every year and trying to find somebody that will come and do it is almost impossible sometimes. So, I'm just wondering, can it be considered to your recommendations on categorizing the every 2 years or every 3 years, whatever it is, for the non...
Through you, Mr. Chair, being top management, being responsible and liable for the system, I would recommend that council not look at this. The reason being, CSA B64 says that any backflow device should be tested annually. If you go to a 3-year, 4-year, or a 2-year program, you're taking that reliability on, and you're taking the liability for that. So ultimately, if a device fails after 2 or 3 years and we have contamination in the system, the city would be liable because we do not follow the annual inspection of a backflow device.
And just following up on that, Councillor Sproul, that means a council would be liable as well for that. Councillor Lauer.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsworth. What would be the situation if you owned buildings downtown and had residences above? Are those residences or apartments above, are they subject to the commercial standards, or are they the residential standards?
Through you, Mr. Chair, ultimately those areas that have properties above, where we actually put our devices on the incoming service. So ultimately, the business plus the apartments up above would be protected by one device.
And therefore, well, I mean, obviously, if you're, I mean, you would take the highest risk, right, which would be the commercial on the bottom. So that one backflow would be subject to a yearly. Despite the fact that the only people in that building for that year might have been a residence, but you'd still have that commercial charge.
That, through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. And there'd only be one requirement there because there's only one backflow device in that whole building. So ultimately, they would be required to inspect that device as the commercial property anyways.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schell. Mayor Clark.
Thank you, and also I will thank our staff for the work that they've done on this in the last couple of years, because I know I've bothered them a few times to dig up some information, because I was dealing with probably this very similar person, as Councillor Spola. So I think I'm hearing fairly loudly and fairly strong-wordedly from our Director of Environmental Services, even though he cites the CSA 2003 level of risk that any commercial property by his professional standards is deemed to be a moderate risk. With that being said, with the onus put on council, all members of council, and I know some have just taken this recently, the duty of responsibility, or whatever the term is, we are ultimately in this community responsible for providing safe drinking water. It's also a best practice recommended by whatever the MOE, the Ministry of Environment, is now called. And also the other thing that the staff have done over the years is look at best practices in other municipalities. And after I saw that information, I was quite comfortable with our level of enforcement. There are a number of municipalities that actually enforce at a more regimented level, and I'm quite comfortable with the level of testing and inspections that is being recommended. So I know I will not be making somebody, at least one person in our community, happy by this, but I will be supporting this recommendation.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, and that motion carries. Thank you so much, Mr. Cho. So folks, before moving on, I know we've got a motion to recess for 5 or 10 minutes. Councillor Eland? 5 minutes is fine. Seconder, Councillor Heen. All those in favor, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you. So folks, welcome back. We're going to get rolling here. We're into departmental reports. Welcome, Ms. Thompson. So our first item is the Economic Development Department regarding Forest Avenue South working group update. And Laura, the floor is yours, so feel free. And then after we'll get into a motion and we'll open up the floor for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As council is aware, the city owns a municipal water lot and concrete pier abutting Forest Avenue South road allowance. There are several docks in the area which serve residents of Grape Island and adjacent property owners, and the area is used by commercial barge operators for the loading and unloading of materials and services. Over the past several years, the city has received complaints regarding the use of this area from Grape Island and Victoria Point property owners. In the spring of 2017, the Grape Island Property Owners Association and Victoria Point residents submitted a joint proposal to address docks and barging, and this proposal was signed by all parties. This report was brought to council. However, Grape Island asked that the report be pulled, and council subsequently withdrew the report from the agenda. Grape Island created a new proposal and attempted to get the support of neighboring property owners, but in December 2017, it was determined that consensus amongst the neighbors was not possible. Staff brought forward several options for consideration in January 2018. At that time, council expressed a desire for the property owners in the area to work together to find their own solution for council's consideration and establish the Forest Avenue South Working Group. A new bylaw was put in place to manage commercial barging and the mooring of boats, and a temporary use bylaw was adopted to allow the temporary use of docks within the area. This bylaw is in place until March 5th, 2020. The working group met once in August 2018 and requested an increased scope to review all shoreline properties in Orillia, both municipally and privately owned, to determine if there was an alternative location where barging could take place. Due to this expanded scope, the project was suspended until the second quarter of 2019 in order to ensure staff resources were available. Since this time, several members representing Grape Island have resigned, and a solicitor has been retained to represent the Grape Island Property Owners Association. This May, Grape Island advised that they are appointing their solicitor to the working group as their representative. Staff believe that the involvement of a solicitor adds complexity to working group discussions. Representatives from Victoria Point have advised that as members of an informal working group, they are not prepared to retain legal counsel, and the city's solicitor has recommended that staff not meet with the solicitor without legal representation. Staff do not believe that consensus among members is possible at this point and have advised that the matter is causing increasing friction between neighbors. It is therefore recommended that council dissolve the working group and direct staff to prepare options for council's consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thompson. Just before we get into discussion and questions, we have a proposed motion before us that this committee recommends to council that is recommended in report ED 1912, dated June 11th, 2019, from the Economic Development Department, the Forest Avenue Working Group be dissolved, and that staff be directed to draft and circulate a survey to collect feedback from Victoria Point and Grape Island property owners as described in Schedule A of the report regarding the use of the Forest Avenue South Road Allowance and municipally owned water lot, and that staff be directed to prepare a report outlining options for a solution which takes into account feedback obtained through the survey, and that $7,500 be approved and allocated from operating contingency for legal fees. Any questions or discussion? Oh, before we get into that, do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Or do we have an alternative motion proposed? Councillor Emont?
Mr. Chair, I'm most anxious that we move forward with the basic direction here. I'm uncomfortable with the second clause of this direction on two points. One is that this has been initially was a disagreement between those who reside close to and approximately an approximation with the Forest Avenue road allowance and those on the island who use that road allowance for access and egress to the island. This research expands opinion to include homes that are and residents who are far removed from the intimacy or the immediacy of the original issue. And I would not want staff to be misled that if we did a survey that included all of these people, that by just the numbers of responses, that this is the direction that we should be going versus this direction. I don't believe that that's correct. So I would prefer that that be modified to have more informal information gathering mechanisms such as a public meeting, a focus group, potentially a survey could be used, be considered rather than dictating this particular mechanism. So if there were a sense around the table, or if I have misread the report and the intention of staff in moving in this direction, then I'm quite open to hearing further argument. But my initial thought at the moment is that this opens up the discussion too broadly on potentially too many issues, that really what we want to do is narrow down the issues to those that have historically been at the root of the problem here, and not allow it to be cluttered by things that are extraneous. It's hard enough, unfortunately, to deal with the impasse that seems to be strengthening in the area, rather than what had been my hope, is that through mutual discussion we could and facilitation we could reach an agreement that everyone said may not be perfect, but at least it works for us, and let's try it out. So that's my position.
Thank you, Councillor Emond. What I would recommend, since we do not have a mover and a seconder for this motion, and that's why we've kind of moved towards this direction in regards to our policy, we can bring a different motion forward, or something similar to this, as you mentioned, with taking some of the things out. So I'm not sure if we have something prepped already, or if we need a little bit of time to pull something together. But I think we'd be happy to have that discussion, because at the end of the day, we do need to have a motion that gets put on the table for discussion or amendments or whatever we decide to do with it. Mayor Clark.
Thank you. I'm really going to more or less echo what Councillor Eamon has said. I understand the rationale behind his justification. Mine is similar, but I also have a different one, and that is we did a survey a few years ago, and sometimes results can come in and present a direction that is more or less undoable. I'm not saying that a survey can't be tailored to mitigate the chances of that doing. I remind the folks of the Homewood example. So I'm quite in favor of having those consultations and those interactions, but I think the survey for those two reasons is something I'd like to see that clause reworded, and I would look to staff maybe for direction on that.
Councillor Heen.
Yes, I agree with Councillor Eamon. When we look at the map that has been accompanies this particular report, it encompasses a very large group of people that really have no concern with this particular crossing, and so when their opinions really aren't going to matter to the people, and so they. I think that we need to have a survey or a focus group that it really concerns the people that are going to be affected by this crossing. So a focus group, or within 500 meters of the crossing, or something like that, because I think it's too broad a grouping at this point.
Councillor Emond.
Mr. Chair, I might suggest to our clerks that phraseology along the lines of, and that staff be directed to collect feedback from Victoria Point and Grape Island property owners regarding the core issues related to the use of the Forest Avenue South road allowance and municipal-owned water lot. Without designating the mechanisms to be used, I don't think it needs to include a phrase that the good offices of the two councillors for the ward are available to assist in every manner possible to achieve that information gathering to the degree that staff would like to draw on that support. But did I Did I make sense? Did I dictate slowly enough?
Councillor Eamon, I believe you did. Let's maybe just give staff a few moments to put something together, and then we'll take a look at what that is and see if that is amenable to folks around the table, and then hopefully get some sort of motion moved and seconded for discussion and questions. So folks, while we're waiting, it's exciting that we have this new process because we're saving so much time right now through the lack of future potential amendments to this, and very happy that we have this new process set out as it gets rid of a lot of the, I would say, redundancy so that we can have more thorough discussion on what we actually would like to discuss for these things. So thank you to staff for bringing forward that new policy that we now use. Councillor Emont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The wording as up there was as I put it forward. I would be interested in receiving feedback from our economic development people and from the CAO as to whether this is reasonable and doable.
Sure. Ms. Thompson.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I might suggest that in regards to amending the wording that we look to scope the exact area and provide clarity in terms of who would be consulted, I might suggest Victoria Crescent and Hayden Avenue, as well as the residents of Grape Island. We previously collected feedback through a previous report, and the majority of comments were from Hayden Avenue, Victoria Crescent, and Grape Island.
Is that something that would be amendable, Councillor Emont, with information coming back from staff putting into that motion?
Mr. Chair, if I may, thank you. Again, I return more to, in this case, my memory is probably a little sounder than it was earlier in the evening, early in the afternoon, but I recall when we first began talking with the folks involved about 3 years ago, as it seems now, the issue was really around how do we accommodate the requirements of two immediate neighbors on the Forest Avenue, adjacent to the Forest Avenue right-of-way, and the concerns that they had with the escalating use of the water lot and shore wall, or what do we call it, the docking there, due to just the expansion of activity and residences, both full-time and summer residences on the island, which is totally appropriate and legitimate, and also the degree to which barging was occurring in the area. When we were focused on those individuals as the primary people to be involved in finding a solution, and we sat down, we originally did come up with a solution that unfortunately didn't seem to meet the full requirements of the Grape Island folks. So in this particular case, I'm still feeling that the immediate neighbors and their representatives, because I do understand that as time goes on, they need the help and advice of others, and I think the working group members that had been appointed from that side of the equation is a useful group and represent that area. I also believe that it would be useful for us to find a way to sit down with the Grape Island folks and hear all of the opinions that exist on the island with respect to how this is operating. And I think it's, I just believe that a survey is a little too impersonal. We need to get beyond the pure facts of the issue and address some of the emotion that obviously underpins this, because that's the part that has been very difficult to come to grips with. Certainly the direction of going to legal counsel is not helpful. because then we litigate. If there is feeling amongst some people that there is a legal issue at stake, then there is a direction that is very clear for that group of people to initiate. Doesn't require us to gather any more information or to spend any more time on this. Go ahead and do it, and we'll deal with it in that manner. But if we're going to actually try and find a solution that works for all the folks around, it's going to happen because we sit down and find a means to create a solution. And we have, if that's not possible, then I guess it'll come down to this council having, with the recommendation, of staff and Councillor Campbell and myself, who have been involved in this since the election, and in my case before that, bringing our point of view to this table and making a recommendation with staff to council, and we'll legislate.
Thank you, Councillor Emond. So just further to that, with help regarding the motion, I see in the motion it talks about the immediate neighbors and such, but doesn't mention the Grape Island folks, and I know that's a comment you made during your remarks, so just checking to make sure that you that in there, or
I'm sorry, the Grape Island folks are equally need to be consulted. It was not my intention to take them out, so no, and please don't, for those in the audience, please don't get me wrong, they are as much a neighbor in this situation, in that sense, and I look at it as neighbors that happen to be just separated by a little bit of water from neighbors who aren't.
Thank you so much, Councillor Eamon. Ms. Thompson?
Through you, Mr. Chair. For clarity, staff suggested the survey in response to a number of comments received from both Victoria Point residents and Grape Island residents who stated that they felt that their group representatives weren't speaking on their behalf. So in the case of Victoria Crescent, there are neighbors aside from the immediate neighbors which may be impacted by a change to commercial barging. So for example, there's properties along Victoria Crescent that would have access to the rear yards of their properties only through a commercial barge, and those property owners did correspond to the city to advise that they felt that their concerns weren't being heard through their representatives.
Councillor Emond?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm not sure that I want to enter into this depth of discussion at this point, but I would observe that from my point of view, the issue of barging has moved the discussions away from where we initially started, notwithstanding that barging was an issue, and that I'm not sympathetic with the creating a commercial barging terminal at the end of Forest Avenue. That is not something that I personally support. We have tried to find ways to accommodate the barging needs, primarily those of Grape Islanders, and particularly the needs that may occur untoward and through emergencies using that facility. But I think the solution of the barging issue is not, if that's necessary for us to resolve that issue prior to our ability to solve this issue, then we should just put this on hold and address the barging issue and get that off the table. Because my belief is that our current barging bylaw is not adequately serving the community nor the barging operators. So, but that's something we put in place to try out, and have been working on it, and I have some opinions on that. But this one, I'm more interested in getting down to how can we accommodate the docking issue, how can we accommodate the parking issue, how can we accommodate the noise and the disturbance that's there. How can we, in fact, allow at least limited barging in the near term so that everyone is satisfied? I'm not particularly interested in Forest Avenue being the barging center of all the homes on Lake Simcoe and area.
Fair enough, Councillor Eamon. I believe this this motion seems very open to me, so I can discuss a few of those things. Councillor Lauer.
Thank you, Councillor Ainsworth. My concern here, I think, is that we're going at it backwards. I think he may be setting up false expectations, collecting feedback. I think we've actually, how long have we been doing this? 3 or 4 years? We certainly have a lot of feedback. I think we understand the situation there. I would rather see us go right to the legal end of things, because I think there's a legal right and a legal wrong here, and that's all there is to it. And I think we should establish what those legal rights are and what the legal wrongs are, and then if that produces a couple solutions, then go back to the folks who live in that area and say these are the options, and see where the feedback comes back there. But if we're going out there and asking for sort of a carte blanche, what do you think? I think we're going to be all over the map, and nobody's going to really be ready to move unless they know what the legal implications are.
Thank you for your points, Councillor Lauer. So with that being said, we've got a bit of a motion here. I don't know if we want to massage it anymore, if we want to get something on the table and then go to amendments. That would be my advice at this point in time, as I see that there's not any further discussion around the table. So maybe we'll see if folks want to move and second the motion that we have before us on the screen. And that is that this committee recommends to Council that further report ED 1912 dated June 11th, 2019 from the Economic Development Department, the Forest Avenue Working Group be dissolved, and that staff be directed to collect feedback from Grape Island residents and the immediate neighbors of the road allowance regarding the core issues regarding the use of the Forest Avenue South road allowance and municipally owned water lot. And that staff be directed to prepare a report outlining options for a solution which takes into account feedback obtained through the feedback. And that seems a little odd in regards to wording. Maybe in information instead of there. We're going to wordsmith this a little bit. That's why we're in the massaging process. And to account feedback obtained. That looks fine to me. Oh, we're printing it out. Okay. No problem. So folks, I'll just read that line again. That the staff be directed to prepare a report outlining options for a solution which takes into account feedback obtained. And that $7,500 be approved and allocated from the operating contingency for legal fees. Is there someone around the table willing to move and second this motion that is before us? Councillor Heen, is that a move? Do we have a seconder around the table to get something on the floor? Mayor Clark? Perfect. Thank you, folks. If not, we would be massaging things a little bit more. And we'll just wait on that motion to come forward. But with that being said, thank you so much. Do we have any discussion, questions, amendments on the table or being discussed? Councillor Sapola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Councillor Eamon or Council Campbell. What's taking so long, Ted? I mean, we've had 4 years, so I'm in favor of eliminating the second, as somebody said earlier, the second paragraph, and just go directly to, let's get the legal opinion, let's have the staff recommendation, and then, yes, everybody needs to be heard, and then sit down, at least we have some options. We have some legal structure that we can say, yeah, we can do this, or we can't do that, or we need permission from XYZ person, so.
Thank you, Councillor Sapola.
So maybe Councillor Eamon would like to answer.
What proposing an amendment at the moment to remove that second paragraph? Or we want to see how the discussion goes? Okay, we will open the floor for more discussion. Councillor Eamon, and then I've got Councillor Fallis. Thank you.
Thank you. Through to my colleague, I suppose it's taken this long because I'm an eternal optimist that people who are passionate about an issue but are able to recognize that others who are involved in the solving of an issue also have a right, can reach a reasonable solution. And unfortunately, to this point in time, we haven't yet found a vehicle for doing that. and it's been a painful exercise because it's not fun to be involved in this. With respect to the legal matters, the legal advice that we have received at the city and the working group is that the city, through its various legislative efforts, is doing what the city has the right to do. And it's not for us to go out and challenge our right. It's for someone else who does not believe that that is the case to initiate that challenge.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Emond. Councillor Campbell. Oh, sorry, Madam Seo, we will jump over to you. You've always got priority around this table.
No, certainly I'm happy to defer to Councillor Campbell, but I just wanted to mention through you, Mr. Chair, that I thought it might be helpful to have Ian Sugden just remind council of where we're at with the temporary use bylaw, and we've already identified that expires in 2020, but if council were to move forward to make that a permanent bylaw, what the implications of that would be, just so that we understand sort of where we're at from the zoning perspective.
Sure, Councillor Campbell, if that's amenable to you, I'll hop over to Mr. Sugden. Mr. Sugden.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So as Ms. Thompson explained in her presentation of the report, the temporary use bylaw, which is a site-specific zoning that applies for a temporary period of time, is scheduled to lapse in March of 2020. So the bylaw has built in a lapse date that council passed at the time a year and a half ago or so. And so once that date hits, the bylaw is no longer in force and effect. So there's a couple of options that can be pursued dealing with that. Council can direct staff to process another temporary use bylaw for a period of up to 3 years, which is what the legislation allows in the Planning Act, or process a more conventional site-specific zoning amendment bylaw, which would act on a permanent basis, so have no lapsing date. So that's the type that we typically do on council meetings. You recall the public meetings we have every month. That's more often done through Section 34 of the Planning Act, which deals with a permanent solution. So in effect, we could take the exact same regulations that were established in the temporary use bylaw and put that forward as a permanent style of zoning amendment and move forward sometime prior to the lapse date or after. The issue is if the bylaw lapses and no other regulations are put into place, neither of the parties that have been at the center of this issue would be able to place docks in compliance with the zoning bylaw on the subject property.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sugden. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I share Councillor Emond's optimism on this. In the fall, when I was wandering around the neighborhood, I can't remember why, but I was fortunate enough to talk to some people from both groups, if you want to put it that way. And what I found were people on both sides that were willing to talk, and they wanted to work things out, and they were willing to compromise. And I was looking forward to the working group reactivating and being a part of it and being a part of the conversation and trying to find some common ground and some solutions. So I think what's being recommended here in this motion, it covers that, and it will allow all voices to be heard and not just the people sitting at the working group table. And I think that will be a good thing. And I hope that that willingness to find a solution that I saw in the fall will continue, and we can do that. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Campbell. Any further discussion or questions on the motion? Councillor Follis.
Thanks. Just a quick question. I can understand kind of a lot of the complexities behind this, but I was just curious, is there ever would there ever be a foreseeable situation where this working group could be reconvened? Is that possible? Is that within the realm of possibility if the parties were to decide that we want to reconvene it?
So, Councillor Follis, council can always create a working group. So if we wanted to have another working group related to this issue, that's definitely something that's possible and has happened in the past with different working groups. If I missed anything, feel free to jump in. Madam
Through
CEO.
you, Mr. Chair, and just as I quite often do, just put the caveat forward that depending on what comes forward from a member of council in terms of their proposal, whether it would be a reconsideration or not. So we would just have to turn our minds to that at that time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any further discussion on the motion? I know there was a potential amendment, Councillor Sepola. I don't know if you were looking for a seconder to remove that second paragraph or not.
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. Just one last call for discussion or questions on this motion. Would anyone like it reread? It is on your screen. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I please request clarity? The immediate neighbors of the road allowance, is that referring to the abutting neighbors only of the road allowance?
That is a very founded question. Maybe I'll pass that one to Councillor Emond. I know you've been vocal on this discussion.
Mr. Chair, it's not as simple as saying we want to go 4 houses to the left and 5 houses to the right. What we want to do is we want to ensure that the immediate, in my mind, the immediate neighbors have an adequate opportunity through some of their immediate neighbors to influence and make sure that the points of view that are strongly held are heard. My intention with the vagueness of it was in fact to allow staff to sit down with Councillor Campbell and I and saying, okay, now that we got to do this, who should we include? As opposed to our sitting here today and trying to dictate who we should include, because I have a feeling that maybe if I had a conversation with some of the folks involved, they'd be very clear about who they think should be involved or not. And I'd be comfortable along the lines that Councillor Campbell has said, that the folks that we would want to have involved are those that really genuinely want to find a solution to this. And so in that sense, I'm hesitant, though I understand staff's concern that lack of precision in these things sometimes create more questions than they answer and makes it difficult. But my commitment, and I believe that of my colleague across the table, is that we're more than willing to sit down and say, let's see if we can scope out the extent of this, because ultimately what we're doing here is we're ensuring that enough information is at the table that a recommendation can come back to this council. We're not asking for the working group to come back with a recommendation. We're asking for staff with our inputs to come back to this table, and ultimately if we don't believe that we have a solution that we're bringing to this table that has a majority of the folks in the area in support of it, then it won't be a successful recommendation regardless. So, and if I shouldn't say extraneous, if issues such as barging, which have impact across our entire city, need to be addressed, then I don't think this is my sense is that this isn't the forum to resolve that issue. This may be the trigger to find a solution or a different solution if one is necessary. So that's a long way of saying I don't know.
Thank you, Councillor Emond, for that direct answer. Councillor Heen, on this particular point?
Perhaps the easier way might be just to remove the word immediate and have Grape Island residents and the neighbors of the road allowance. And then that gives you a little bit more leeway as to who you're going to involve.
Madam CEO, if you'd like to hop in on this.
Through you, Mr. Chair, certainly if the councillor would like to bring forward that amendment, that could be done. I was just going to, based on what Councillor Eamon had indicated, the interpretation that staff would take by the motion that's before you without that amendment would be that staff from economic development will be working with the ward councillors on this overall issue. So in order to solicit the feedback and to work through that feedback, it would be my interpretation of this motion that staff work with the 2 ward councillors on this particular issue. Could I just get clarification that that is in fact an appropriate interpretation?
I will look to our councillors. Yes, that sounds like a yes to me. And just Ms. Thompson, in regards to that change, would that be something that helps you out a little bit in regards to opening it up to the neighbors potentially?
That does, thank you.
Okay, we've got a mover, Councillor Emond, for that amendment, which is just removing immediate. And we've got a seconder with Mayor Clark for that amendment. And we'll just wait till I get that in front of me, and we will get that discussed and on the table. But while we're waiting for that, is there any discussion on that particular amendment, which is to remove one word? Hopefully not too much discussion. No, perfect. So folks, before me, I have an amendment to the main motion moved by Councillor Emond, seconded by Mayor Clark. The motion now before committee be amended by deleting the word immediate in the second paragraph. Any discussion or questions on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor, that amendment carries. So folks, moving on to the original motion as amended, is there any further discussion or questions or amendments? Seeing none, all those in favor, and that carries. Thank you so much, Ms. Thompson. Sure, and just for our guests in the audience, I see there's quite a few of them in regards to the last item. This is committee, so this isn't completely approved. It will go to next week's meeting to council for ratification, just to put that out there for folks. So if people did want to comment, that would probably be a good time over the next week to reach out to folks. So folks, moving on to item number 2, Parks, Recreation and Culture Department regarding ice resurfacer doors at Rotary Place. And I'm not sure who would like to start us off, but staff, feel free to start us off, and then we'll get a motion on the table and then open the floor for discussion and questions if there are any.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the purpose of this report is to seek council approval to replace both ice resurfacer doors at Rotary Place due to ongoing repair costs and safety concerns with the current counterweight system. Rotary Place arenas were designed with an overhead ice access door system on the corner of each ice resurfacer due to the design of the building, which located the ice resurfacer room directly between the two rinks. This type of door system is unique in the industry, as most arena doors are of this swing design, similar to Brian Orser Arena, or the door system resides on a flat section of the board system. It is estimated that each door weighs approximately 1,500 pounds. During the ice season, the doors are used somewhere between 15 to 20 times per day, which means over 5,000 times per ice season. In 2019, the doors have broken down twice on each side, resulting in the cancellation of ice time and lost revenue of approximately $5,000, along with repair costs of over $6,000 in the last 6 months. Both repair and replacement options have been explored. Ice bookings are scheduled to begin on July 15th. The recommended option for replacement with a different style of door opening mechanism, which will eliminate the safety concerns and provide for a more robust system. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, we have a motion before us that this committee recommends to council that as recommended in a report PRCD 1906 dated June 11th, 2019 from the Parks, Recreation and Culture Department. Athenaletta Sports Systems be contracted to replace both ice resurfacer doors at Rotary Place, and that a budget of $80,000 be allocated from the Major Capital Facility Maintenance Reserve for the replacement. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Emond, seconded by Councillor Sepola. I will open up the floor for discussion and questions. Councillor Emond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to say that I'm in support of this, and just to give you some background, I was doing my council prep outdoors last evening on my back deck, and when I got to this particular section, a chill came over me that overcame my ability to stay outside and barbecue. I had to go in, so...
Thank you, Councillor Emond. Any further discussion or questions, Councillor Spola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Was this sole source, or did they have an opportunity for an RFP or request for tender?
Through you, Mr. Chair. We did approach multiple board companies and have been working with 3 different overhead door companies throughout the year with all the repairs that we have already done. Two of the board companies that we contacted, one hasn't really reached back out, and the other one, it's a very unique design and really didn't have any ideal solutions that they could initiate right off the bat. Athletica has installed this exact door system on the corner of an arena in Port Perry, so we felt quite comfortable when we went and viewed what they had done there and talked with their staff if they've had any issues or anything, which they haven't, so that's how this came about.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to hear that you folks have had discussions with Athletica. Any further discussion or questions? No, seeing none, all those in favor, and that carries. Thank you so much. So folks, moving on to item number 3, the Development Services and Engineering Department regarding site alteration bylaw. So welcome folks, and feel free to take the floor, and then after that we'll get a motion up on the floor and then open up the floor for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of council, fellow staff, and honored guests, Report DSC 1920 puts forth the case for council to adopt the proposed Chapter 373 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code for site alterations. Site alterations, broadly defined, are activities that modify the existing grade of a property. The proposed Chapter 373 of the Municipal Code addresses an existing gap within the city's authority to regulate site alterations, specifically filling the area for site alterations that existing development agreements do not cover. Existing agreements, such as plan of subdivision or site plan agreement, provide the city with the authority and tools needed to review and address site alterations on those projects. This chapter, if adopted, would provide city staff with the authority and tools required to regulate site alterations in situations where other agreements are not required by the user. This is an important area for the city to have authority in order to ensure that existing drainage patterns are maintained, which in turn protects water quality, city utility infrastructure, and helps prevent scenarios where site alterations create injurious impacts on adjacent properties. City staff have completed extensive research, review, and consultation on the proposed chapter. This included consultation with the construction and development community. Input was incorporated into the chapter where practicable. One of the main concerns about the proposed chapter from the development community was that although the proposed chapter may cover most projects, there are projects that fall outside of the scope of this chapter. On the smaller scale, there are built-in exemptions within the chapter, but there were no concessions or such exemptions for large scale. So this was a very good issue that was brought up, and staff did address this issue by incorporating a site alteration agreement within the proposed chapter. This would allow the applicant to propose changes to the standard requirements set out in the chapter, and then the city staff would review and they'd work through that together. This modification that is part of the draft before you greatly increases the flexibility of the chapter to handle all scenarios and not just your standard typical scenarios. So through the input and research, staff have drafted and developed the draft before you. And it strikes a balance between potential impacts to the development community, as well as the city's responsibilities under the Municipal Act, Lake Simcoe Protection Act, as well as provincial and industry best standards, best practices. It is based on this research, consultation, review, and balance that the city staff put forth the recommended motion within DSC 19-20. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, with that being said, we do have a motion before you that this committee recommends to council that as recommended in report DSE 1920 dated June 11th, 2019 from the Development Services and Engineering Department, Chapter 373 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code, site alteration, be adopted as set out in Schedule A of the report. and that Chapter 452 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code, user fees, environmental services and operations / development services and engineering be amended as set out in the report. And that Chapter 170 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code, municipal bylaw enforcement officer be amended to appoint staff of the Development Services and Engineering Department as municipal bylaw enforcement officers for the purpose of Chapter 373. And that Chapter 251 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code, delegated authority be amended to designate the Director of Development Services and Engineering or designate with the authority to enter into site alteration agreements as set out in Chapter 373. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Lauer, seconded by Councillor Campbell. Any discussion or questions on this motion? Councillor Lauer and then Councillor Spola.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's great to see this arrive on the table. It's long awaited, and I think it's very, very important. As opposed to asking a whole bunch of little questions, I just ask a couple big ones, okay? And they should be yes or no answers. In Ward 4, just in well, not in the near. Not in the near years, but we've had a lot that somebody started dumping a whole bunch of, it was a building lot and they started dumping a whole lot of earth on, and then we had another one, I'm not identifying these for a reason, but we had another one on another street where before construction, they did a lot of site alteration, which affected the surrounding properties. Down on Bay Street, we had a retaining wall built that wasn't subject to any inspection, I guess. That eventually collapsed. And then if I get out of the ward, you go down to Rexton and what happened there and what's happening there. Does this solve all those problems?
I'll let you answer that loaded question, Jeremy. With a yes or no answer.
So the intent of this would be to cover projects such as that fall outside of other agreements. So most of the projects that you described, I believe, fall outside of, say, a site plan agreement or a plan of subdivision, and that is where this would, this chapter would take place. So it would address the majority of those concerns.
So that was a yes.
Yes.
So if I could just follow up just quickly. So if what out of curiosity would be the process? So if I'm living on the street and there's a vacant lot there and suddenly somebody starts pushing earth around and suddenly it's, you know, the drainage pattern changes, you're not necessarily going to be out there picking up on that. I'm going to pretty well have to phone the city and ask that it be looked into, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. It would be complaint driven for the enforcement. With ones where we're not aware of, where we are aware of a site alteration and we have a permit in place, then we would be doing review of they're responsible to give us inspection reports. So ones that we're aware of and have a permit, we will be continually reviewing. But for ones that people are trying to get around having a permit or not aware they should have a permit, that would be complaint driven.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any further discussion, Councillor Cipolla?
Thank you. Just a very quick question. Does this contravene any statute or legislation from the Ontario that a developer or somebody can come to us and sue us or take us to the OMB or whatever? Are we violating any statute or legislation from the province?
No.
Perfect.
Okay.
I do like that answer. But as we know, Councillor Cipolla, people can always sue us for pretty much anything nowadays. Councillor Klustra.
Through Mr. Chair to staff. So if I'm a developer and I'm moving less than 1,000 cubic meters of, say, earth or topsoil aggregate, do I still have to get a permit?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, you would have to still get a permit.
So like if you're, so 1,000 cubic meters would be roughly like 100 dump trucks kind of. So if you're a developer right now and if you want to move all your material before, I guess, January 2020, would you be still under the implications, or will there be any implications of a site alteration agreement right now?
So the plan for the chapter would be coming to effect on January 1, 2020. So anything done before that would not be taken into account. It would be as of January 1, 2020.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Councillor Emont, I believe you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A general comment and then my question. I'm always nervous when we introduce new regulation. I'm fully aware of the circumstances that have led us to realize this is required, so I'm in support of it. It's a shame that the behavior of the few result in regulation being applied to so many, and that regulation requires activity and fees and things, but I appreciate that you've attempted to make it as streamlined as possible. My question relates to, how does this relate to, or does it replace our tree bylaw, or the taking down or destroying of trees? I mean, we did have that situation on what was it, Cedar Island Road and Elgin at one point. Would this bylaw prevent that, or do we have another bylaw that looks after trees?
Through you, Mr. Chair, this bylaw is just for site alterations. We still have Chapter 370 of the Municipal Code that does cover tree removal. So that is still freestanding on its own. This Chapter 373 does reference Chapter 370, that you have to be in compliance with our tree removal policy. But this one does not specifically cover tree removal. That's covered elsewhere.
However, if I may, Mr. Chair, the removal of not a tree, but a block of trees like happened on that property could have impact on the water table, could have impact on the drainage, could have impact on those things, which are in fact part of what you're describing here as the consequences of potential site alteration.
Correct. So through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. In the sense that the site alterations would be enforced through Chapter 373, but anything to do with the trees and the removal of the trees would still stay under Chapter 370. So they would be working very closely in tandem. At one point, we had potentially thought of a draft of incorporating the two of them together. It was much cleaner to keep them separate. So they do reference each other, and they will work in tandem.
Mr. Sugden?
Just through you, Mr. Chair, further to what Mr. Duke has explained. So the Chapter 370 deals with the removal of trees, which can be done without grubbing or without the removal of the stumps and other things. So without altering the site, just cutting the trees down. So that's why we've kept them separate. Somebody might want to just cut trees but leave the stumps in place, which leaves the soil in place. But if they want to do grubbing, which removes the stumps and the roots and everything else, then it exposes us to site alteration impacts, and that's where this one would kick in.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the clarification. Any further discussion on this motion? Questions, amendments? No, seeing none. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you so much. Well, welcome back. So folks, moving on to item number 4, Development Services and Engineering Department regarding the overview of Bill 108, More Homes, More Choice Act 2019. So staff, the floor is yours, and then we will get into the motion and then the discussion following that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The legislation impacting land use planning is changed again with the introduction of Bill 108, which is an omnibus bill that the government purports will support business growth and increase the supply of housing. This report only looks at the legislative changes as they relate to land use planning, although there are a number of other acts that have been amended. Most notably, many of the 2018 Planning Act changes are being rolled back, particularly related to appeals, but also notably draft plans of subdivision will no longer be able to be appealed by members of the public, and density and height bonusing has been replaced by community benefits. And in order to collect these community benefits, the city would need to prepare a community benefits charge strategy and pass a bylaw, and would also not then be able to collect parkland dedication. Although Bill 108 has received royal assent on June 6, 2019, this new legislation is not currently in effect. Bill 108 still needs to be proclaimed by the government, and it is our understanding from speaking with ministry staff that there are going to be transition regulations that are going to be introduced before Bill 108 is proclaimed. So we have some time before the legislation comes in, but we don't know how much time. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, folks, we have a motion before us that this committee recommends to Council that report DSE 1923, dated June 7th, 2019, from the Development Services and Engineering Department regarding an overview of Bill 108, the More Homes, More Choice Act 2019, be received as information. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor Sepola. Any discussions or questions? Councillor Sepola, and then Councillor Lauer, Councillor Follis, and Councillor Hean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look on page 6, Endangered Species Act provides a 1-year grace period for development. Is that taken out of the equation now? Or I really don't understand what this Bill 108 does to the Endangered Species Act. Maybe you can explain it to me a little bit, because we have a lot of turtles around the area. A lot of that stuff where I'll use an example. It's not within the city, but the Orwalton camp, for instance, if it's being developed, endangered species such as turtles and that kind of stuff will be greatly impacted. So what does Bill 108 do to the endangered species?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So generally, my read or understanding of it is it's rolling back some of the regulations and rules, although it does give the power, as it indicates that the minister may now have the power to stop developers then from engaging in an activity that would adversely impact species at risk. So they've added more powers to themselves, but generally they propose they could introduce more regulations that would allow developers greater latitude when it comes to developing and destroying habitats for species at risk.
So supplementary to that, through our staff, is there any way that the city can, within our city limits, can bylaw or some kind of a planning document as part of a policy that can override this?
No.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't think that's something that we have the ability to do, and we certainly don't have any staff on that would work for the city that are experts in this regard.
Yeah, thank you.
Just as a reminder, Councillor Spola, the municipality does operate at the pleasure of the province.
I can appreciate that, and I know that, Mr. Chairman. I just have some concerns that this Bill 108 creates some dangerous situation for our endangered species. So I just hope that they come to their senses and protect our wildlife.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your comments, Councillor Sepola. Councillor Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You can just cut me off. I've got quite a few questions. Number one is, what is good planning?
That's the third floor.
Here, let's start there.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a very gray question. So it's essentially a test that has been in place for many, many years in planning, is that the test is, does a particular development application represent good planning? And that is in the opinion of the land use planner that is before the LPAT making that testament.
Okay, so in an optimistic moment when I read this stuff, bullet down a little bit further, it says removes the ability for the tribunal, that's LPAT, to dismiss an appeal on grounds that the appeal is not consistent with provincial policy and does not conform to provincial plans. And I don't know how many times we've seen things come across this table that have said this conforms and we should be doing this because it conforms, and then people go off and try to make that argument. Does that not give us a little bit more power? Not power, but I don't know what the word is. Yes, thank you, David. Stronger position when it comes to trying to, doing a few abstracts things like protect neighborhoods and things like that. Just as stable neighborhoods.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if it gives us more power or not, but what the changes have done is in 2018, when the Planning Act was changed, you absolutely needed to conform to the provincial plans and the policy, and that was a critical test. This change, that's an important test, but it's not the only test. So it's going back to the old system, which is we look at those things. We always look at what the provincial plans say and the policies say, but it's not the only aspect that we look at. And so we also look at what is good land use planning. And so it's going back to what the old system was.
So does it undercut the notion of intensification or the strength of the intensification argument?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe it does because we still have the 2019 A Place to Grow plan, which is the new growth plan, which still really focuses on building complete communities and keeping our intensification targets in place.
Okay, can I carry on, or do you want to stop?
Well, it depends how many questions you have, Council.
I got a couple more, but
Got a couple more?
Yep.
Feel free. I don't see any hands around the table.
okay. So down below, we have restricts community benefits for what was formerly referred to as high density bonusing. Has that put an end to our policy here in town, where we have height bonuses and things like that, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I definitely need more training with the ministry on this aspect to understand how that's going to impact us, because you're correct. Our official plan does allow people to have additional height in certain areas in exchange for these community benefits. That whole section of the Act has completely changed. So I don't actually know what the impact will be on us and how quickly we would have to make modifications to our official plan to remove those requirements. I need to certainly learn more about that, but it's essentially changing quite significantly.
Sure. Mr. Sugden.
Through you, Mr. Chair, from what we understand currently, and I say that because there's still ongoing training being offered by the ministry on this, is in the Orillia context, we have in our official plan, within the central core intensification area, we have building heights that are permitted in our official plan in a series of 3 numbers. One of the lowest, which is the minimum height required, the middle one, which is the maximum height required without density bonusing, and the third one is a maximum height that may be permitted through a density bonusing provision. And that requires a site-specific zoning amendment to allow for that currently. So if somebody wants to go up to, say, 12 stories where otherwise they're only permitted 4 normally, they can make an application for a density bonusing height bylaw exemption under Section 37 of the Planning Act, and municipalities effectively negotiate what community benefits they're providing to justify the extra height. So this is intended, the changes in Bill 108 are intended to make that a more stable platform rather than negotiating with individual municipalities on a case-by-case basis. The calculation for community benefits should be made more clear and concise, and that's where the community benefits charges bylaw that Ms. Lewis spoke about would have to be worked out, and it would then change. We'd have to go back and amend our official plan to deal with that height differently in those policies.
Thank you. I do have 2 more, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lauer. We're going to hop over to Councillor Follis, and then we've got Councillor Heen in queue, and then we will come back to Councillor Lauer, potentially.
Thanks. Just a statement from me. I want to stress that I do appreciate the work of the city staff. Although I recognize that this vote will not affect the outcome of the bill's implementation, out of principle, I am going to vote against this report. I think that there was an opportunity to be more definite with our position. Overall, this legislation is detrimental to municipalities and to the environment. There are countless organizations, including AMO, as we know, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, that have voiced concern and opposition, along with many municipalities themselves. And one of the primary issues that's been cited has been around development charges. From AMO's recommendation, I just want to read it out, that there is a great municipal concern that legislation could result in lowering the development charge revenue that is needed so growth can pay for growth. Municipalities need to be able to support growth in our communities. Anyway, thanks very much, and yeah, I won't be supporting this.
Thank you, Councillor Follis. Councillor Heen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask about community benefits as well. In your report, you mentioned that Matchadash Lofts and 75 Berry Road were two examples of when community benefits applied. And then you just talked about how, although there were certain landmarks where they could go higher. And so then I thought, does that mean, for instance, although we've been very specific about what we want with the metro property, and we have had a top site of 8 stories, that with community benefits they could actually go higher than that. So can you elaborate a little bit more about community benefits and then how that could affect us in Orillia?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it's now entirely different. It's getting away from you can have more height if you do this, if you give us these additional benefits. We have to look at, it's an entirely new regime that it's more like if you want to collect for parkland, you do it either through the parkland process or you do it through a community benefits bylaw. And so community benefits are really looking at a way for the municipality to garner funds for what are called soft services. And it can apply to any type of application, whereas currently under the height bonusing, it's only for properties that go through a specific rezoning to add additional height. They're opening up community benefits that if you need a building permit, you could pay community benefits. If you're doing a part lot control exemption bylaw, you can pay community benefits, but you pay community benefits, but you don't get to collect parkland dedication. It's one or the other. And right now in the city of Orillia, pretty much every application, the applicant, the proponent, is paying something towards parkland contribution.
Councillor Heem.
Supplementary. So do we have a choice? If someone says to us, we want to go higher, we want to pay community benefits, can we say, no, we want our height restriction to be this amount, or are we tied into, do we have to do this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we're going to need to amend our official plan again to remove that you get additional height if you give us community benefits. That piece of the plan will need to come out as my understanding of what Bill 108 is doing, and it will be just setting ultimate heights in the official plan and not conditional heights, which currently the official plan has it conditional.
Mr. Sugden.
And through you, Mr. Chair, further to what Ms. Lewis just responded, regardless of what changes we do in the official plan, it is a statutory right of anybody to make application to change the official plan policies or the zoning bylaw regulations. So even once we get caught up to what Bill 108 requires us to do, someone can still come in and make an application for greater height. They just won't be able to use the community benefits piece of it as part of their justification for the height. They'll have to make their own standalone justification for that case.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Councillor Lauer, if you have any more questions, now would be an appropriate time.
Thank you very much. Just quickly, under Development Charges Act, we are now basically deferring development charges for 5 years for nonprofits and any rental build, right? But also the institutional, industrial, and commercial, which I concur with the report here that wonders why. Other than maybe it's an economic development move just on the side. I don't know, but will we be allowed to charge interest on those? So they're not paying, they're paying over 5 years. The way we defer them now, we charge 4%, 4.25%. And I'm just wondering if we're going to still be able to make that kind of money on our investment.
Welcome to the table, Mr. Lang.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. The Act was created at a fairly high level, and both staff, provincial staff, and the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing has indicated that there will be many regulations to come out. But our understanding at this point is that yes, municipalities will be able to charge interest. That's been indicated in general terms. The regulations will go into more details where municipalities are hoping to clarify that and many issues related to the new act.
So if I could, a developer may choose to pay them right up front.
Again, without details on the regulation, I'm assuming that there will be an option to pay up front, but depends on how restrictive the regulation is. Wouldn't make sense that they wouldn't be provided that opportunity.
Okay, my last question, and I promise, is to do with the Ontario Heritage Act. And I'm just wondering, the second clause talks about the appeal rights. And I'm wondering, does that only pertain to when a property is newly designated and deal only with the owner at that time, or is this transferable, say, and I'll just go to an example we all know about, which is a central school. So we have a designation on that. Is it retro appealable by the new owner, or is it just that initial owner and once it's in place, it's in place?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't know the answer to that question. It'd be something that we would have to research with the legislation.
Mr. Sugden?
Through you, Mr. Chair, further on this issue, at this point, the Heritage Act designation bylaws cannot be retroactively appealed. Someone can put forward proposals to demolish a building or alter a building, and ultimately to ask council to repeal a bylaw that designates it. So for instance, if a building deteriorates to a condition where it cannot be saved anymore, or somebody wants to move a designated building off of a designated heritage site, you would need to, in that instance, you would need to repeal the bylaw to allow it to be removed off the site and relocated to another site where it may be redesignated again. So those options currently exist. I think this is more about the process of appeal for a new designation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, folks. Mayor Clark?
I find this absolutely interesting. I think Jim maybe summed it up best when he said, they introduced it at such a high level. So I question why they would do that. I'm assuming maybe they just wanted to throw it out there with the framework and garner feedback, which I'm sure they have received much of, as Councillor Fallis has said. And with respect to Councillor, my colleague, I'm not sure if not accepting this as information is going to have any significant effect on the province. So, but do as you will. It's just so fraught with questions, around CB, the community benefit charges, the second dwelling exemptions, perhaps, DCs over 5 years. Who's going to collect? What it does to our cash flow, and if property changes hands, who even pays for the stuff? The DC changing from the building permit process to the site application process. It seems like it's going to have potentially a significant effect on either cash flow to the city or just the cash flow to the city, probably at the very least. And the other thing I find interesting is, although they're not going to enact it until they have a proclamation date, they're bringing in the transition regulations, which to me almost make the proclamation date moot. Or am I missing something? I guess the actual question I have is, they're doing some training now, or is there substance to the training that is available right now? Like, are we learning any more about this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we are going to partake in some training sessions. Our professional association is offering one at the end of the month, but we haven't had the benefit of any training at this point. So we have as many questions as you have on the legislation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any further discussion or questions around the table on this particular motion? Anyone like it reread? Nope. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you so much. No. So folks, moving on to item number 5, Development Services and Engineering Department regarding implementation of on-street parking change request policy. So folks, if you want to start us off, and then we'll get the motion on the table and go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of council, fellow staff, and honored guests, Report DSC-1925 provides an overview of the proposed policy for on-street parking change requests. Currently, if a resident, councillor, or staff member wish to modify the existing parking regulations on a street, there's no formal process to be followed. Rather, the request gets put forth to council, and council directs staff to investigate the request. Policy 2.9.1.1 Guidelines for Procedures for On-Street Parking Change Request provides a formalized process on how these requests will be addressed. Having a formalized process provides clarity for residents, provides answers for councillors if a resident has a question about how to change the parking regulations currently existing, and it provides a standardized method of review for staff. This policy establishes a transparent and equitable process for all to follow and have a clear understanding of what's required and what the process is to have existing on-street parking regulations changed. Based on these factors and the additional points set out in the report, staff recommended that policy 2.9.1.1 Guidelines for Procedures for On-Street Parking Change Requests policy be adopted. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, before us, we have a motion that this committee recommends to council that as recommended in report DSE 1925 dated June 7th, 2019 from the Development Services and Engineering Department, policy 2911, guidelines and procedures for on-street parking change requests be adopted as set out in Schedule A of the report. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor Klustra. Any discussion or questions on this? Maybe I'll get Councillor Eamon to start us off, and then Councillor Lauer and Councillor Klustra, I have you in queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I was reading the process, it struck me that you were relieving a tremendous burden from the councillor. Because up till now, most of the parking requests that I have received have come from a resident or a resident association in the case of the condo recently, who have come to me and said, can we get something like this to happen? And I have dutifully put forward a inquiry motion, and the process goes under. So I don't have to do that anymore. I can just say, here's the policy, go for it.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on that, when it comes to the application, this is fairly onerous in that the individual who wants to have the change must go out and solicit from a certain number of neighbors who would be impacted by this change. And you have to have a response from 50% of those. And I do recall that when staff did that survey within the villages of Leacock, we didn't get anywhere close to 50%. And that was staff doing it, and they're really expert at gathering this kind of information. I'm just wondering if that kind of burden on our residents is a little more than I think I was looking for, in the hopes that this kind of a policy might provide us with guidelines that we can use with staff. But I'll let you respond to that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the intent of the 51% is really to ensure that there is public support from local residents to have the change. And we've based it on the traffic calming policy, and that also has a 51% requirement. So that was our reasoning for that, is to make sure that anyone who's impacted, mostly directly, not so much indirectly, because it's not intended to cover someone 3 streets over, but people that are directly impacted, whether it's adding parking or removing parking, have a say on that.
Perfect. Thank you. Councillor Lauer, then Councillor Klustra.
Thank you very much. Just following up on Ted's point, to me, that's very dangerous, making that offer to the public, because they'll see the 51% as vote in favor and so do it type thing. So when we do that, we're going to have to make sure that they understand that what they're getting 51% is that it's 50% in favor of the ask. It's not in favor of anything, right? Because I think that's where we get in trouble. We put these surveys out, and people don't quite understand that it's approval to ask the question, right? So I would be very careful of that, and I think I'm almost sympathetic to the idea of lowering that to below 51% just from the point of optics. You know, that you're not saying, okay, if you get over 51%, you've got approval here. It's just saying, okay, you got 30%, there's obviously a concern, so let's look into it, right? But anyway, that's for your consideration. Not even a yes or no answer to that, Jeremy. But there is one other question, and that is the 60 meters. I think that's huge. That's a big space. I think we often have concerns where there's only 4 cars that are kind of in the way, and that's all we need to do. So is there any way we could maybe alter that or make that just a little bit more flexible?
Sure, Mr. Sugden.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the 60 meters we utilized the same distance we use for minor variance applications, which in those cases, those are small changes to regulations that affect the immediate neighbors. And so that regulation for 60 meters comes out of the Planning Act in that example. For a parking space is 5.5 to 6 meters long on the street, unless it can be longer as well. So that translates to just a few number of parking spaces. When you divide 60 by 6, it's 10 parking spaces in length. So we're trying to come up with a number for this policy that puts it into the immediate neighborhood context and not sending people around multiple blocks to ask a question about their specific location.
Councillor Cloustra.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. With this policy in effect to staff, will a councillor or other councillors be able to bring an inquiry motion forward if you do not get the 51% status for the questionnaire?
So, Councillor Cloustra, it is always within Council's pleasure to bring forward pretty much any inquiry motion, but feel free, staff, if you want it. Mr. Sugden.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So we currently have 2 policies similar to this one, which is the sidewalk policy, and one which is the traffic calming policy, both of which provide a similar type of direction. So if council is being approached by a constituent asking to change the parking rules in this case, ideally, what that member of council would do is refer them to this policy and to the information on the city's website and get them to begin the process. So that the ask can be made. If they meet that threshold, then we would then do the staff analysis that we typically do. It just, the policy is really intended to save the one-off requests that we've done a number of reports on over the years, and council has spent a lot of time dealing with issues. There's as many solutions to parking as there are people, so this is helping to funnel the concepts to a neighborhood level solution.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Lauer.
Thank you. Sorry to go back. So I was listening to your answer to my 60-meter question. You're talking about the radius of which people have to be contacted. I'm talking about the bullet before, where it says the length of the affected area needs to be 60 meters. Right, the third line there of that first bullet. Or sorry, under initiation, the third bullet.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the intent of that was because we really don't want to change on-street parking for 1 or 2 spots. From a planning perspective, from an engineering perspective, we'd much rather have parking be across segments of streets. So that's where we got the 60-meter minimum length of a segment to change.
Okay, so I go back to my original question, though, or concern, and I do believe you do get issues where there's just 4 cars that might affect somebody and not be necessary to go beyond that. And 60 meters, if 5 meters a car, is 12 cars, right? So I'm just wondering about that flexibility of that, not the circle.
Through you, Mr. Chair, based on how this is currently written, that would be a one-off if it was not meeting the minimum requirements. That would have to be a request through council to look at something that is not part of the policy.
Mr. Sugden.
Through you, Mr. Chair, alternatively, council through, or council committee through an amendment to the motion could direct a different number to that threshold distance.
Folks, any further discussion or questions or proposed amendments are on the table? Seeing none, all those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Welcome, Lee. So folks, moving on to item number 6, the Clerk's Department regarding the 2018 annual status report for the multi-year accessibility plan. So the floor is yours, and then once we get through that, we're going to get into the motion and then discussion and questions afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The report before you provides an annual update on the progress of the measures taken to implement the strategies referred to in the Orillia 5-year multi-year accessibility plan, also known as the MyApp, which was adopted by Council in October of 2017. This is the first annual status report to the MyApp since it was adopted. In formulating the report, all city departments were requested to provide any updates to the MyApp, and these have been included in Schedule A of this report. Thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, before us, we have a motion that this committee recommends to Council the report CD 1907, dated May 6, 2019, from the Clerk's Department regarding the 2018 annual status report for the multi-year accessibility plan be received as information. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this motion? Moved by Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor Cloustra. Any questions or discussion on the motion? Mayor Clark.
Thank you, and thank you for the report, Ms. Kenderdine. Just a couple of comments. One is with respect to the rec center, and you've listed a number of the items, through you, Mr. Chair, sorry. You've listed a number of items or areas that will certainly be accessible. You know, with a new facility, I think that's almost a given these days, as it should be. But I just wonder if you could speak to the fitness equipment itself within the fitness room that may be accessible. And my only other statement is really a comment. I last year got into a wheelchair a few times, and a couple times got on the transit, and not our OWL service, our regular transit. And I just want to say that those new buses, the way they lower to the curb, they really actually are relatively, if not very user-friendly for those in a wheelchair. And I've asked others, and one of the comments they had was, yes, they are much more accessible, they're much more user-friendly, but the drivers seem to have an elevated level of ability to take care of them now when they get on the bus. So I think that's a great step in the right direction. But if you could just speak to the fitness equipment and how that works, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Megan?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the MyApp is coordinated by input from various departments, and so perhaps the Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture or the Director of Facilities would be most appropriate to answer that question with respect to the Recreation Centre.
Mr. Markley?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly through the aid of a grant program, we were successful in upgrading several pieces of the fitness equipment to be totally accessible. So they'll be part of the new fitness center. They're currently down at Brian Norris Arena, and we'll move them to the new fitness center when it's open.
And just for clarity, so this will give somebody the ability not to have to shuffle out of their wheelchair into a different type of seating apparatus. They can go in with the wheelchair or their device, their whatever device they're using, and use the equipment. Is that correct?
So, Mr. Chairman, I believe there's both styles. There's both ones that do allow for that, but there's also ones that are just accessible where you would shuffle from your chair to the equipment.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mr. Merkley. Councillor Heen, and then I've got Councillor Spoll in queue.
It's really good to see that every year that we're increasing the number of options that are available for people with accessibility problems. But the one building that you've left off is this building. All the washrooms are now accessible, and I was wondered why this building was left off.
Through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps Director of Facilities would like to weigh in on that.
Sure, Mr. Guptill.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure whether it's an update from a previous report that it was already included, and these are changes that have been made to that.
That seems like a yes, Mr. Gavel.
Lee, perhaps you can echo that.
Certainly, through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, this is just a status update for the past year. So those any of those changes would have been in the original document, which was approved by Council in 2017.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Spola.
Thank you. Through you to our staff, Mr. Chairman. Our playgrounds in our parks are pretty well all accessible now to wheelchair on the playground, are they not?
Mr. Merkley?
Through Mr. Chair, certainly in your new installations, we do have to be accessible, so they're either accessible with the use of a rubber play surface or a 5-bar play surface. We do still have some sand surfaces, and as they get replaced, they will be upgraded to accessible surfaces.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any further discussion or questions or proposed amendments on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, and that carries. Thank you so much. So, folks, moving on to inquiry motions. Item number 1, Councillor Spola will introduce the following inquiry motion. That this committee recommends to Council that staff be directed to prepare a report with respect to the following: the feasibility and costs associated with implementing closed captioning for Orillia City Council meetings. And Councillor Spola, do you have a seconder for this motion? Councillor Lauer. Perfect. And then Councillor Spola, maybe if you'd like to start us off, if you have any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's pretty well self-explanatory. I've had several calls, people wanting to either hearing impaired or whatever, that they would like to see the closed caption on our council meetings.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Spola. Any further questions or discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that carries. Thank you. Folks, moving on to inquiry number 2, Councillor Follis will introduce the following inquiry. That this committee recommends to Council that staff be directed to prepare a report with respect to the following: the feasibility of reciting a traditional land acknowledgement statement at the beginning of Council committee and Council meeting as a practice of reconciliation aimed at the recognizing the traditional or treaty territories of Indigenous peoples. Councillor Follis, do you have a seconder for this motion? Councillor Lauer, and if you'd like to say a few words, feel free.
Thanks. I just thought I'd give a bit of an explanation on this. Most will know what this is, but just in case, and then also go into a bit of the reasoning behind it. I thought I'd refer to a CBC News article that was published by Ramna Shahzad, and it describes what a land acknowledgement is. So it's described as an act of reconciliation that involves making a statement recognizing the traditional territories of the Indigenous people who called the land home before the arrival of settlers, and in many cases still do call it home. Today, there's actually many of examples of this at the municipal level throughout Ontario and throughout Canada. Some examples include Guelph, Toronto, Burlington, closer to home, Huntsville, Collingwood. AMO has quite an extensive web page explaining how municipalities can go about the process. Within our own community, we also have Lakehead University that has a land acknowledgement, as well as Simcoe County District School Board. So there's many examples across the board. I really want to emphasize a lot of practical reasons, as I'm sure many of my fellow councillors and many of my council colleagues will agree. First of all, it's certainly to be considered part of the many of the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as findings from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And I do want to emphasize that this acknowledgement, it's not the solution to the many transgressions and historical mistreatment that have occurred, but it's a step in the right direction. The final thing I wanted to leave everyone with that I thought really drove home the importance of doing this was it's a quote from that same CBC article from Greg Waboose, who belongs to the Abmitung First Nation in Northern Ontario. So he says, quote, a lot of people are unaware of Canada's actual history, and this gets people talking and conversations started. Personally, I feel like I can have a conversation about who I am, where I'm from, and what I'm doing in the city. He's referring to Toronto. It shows that people are willing to hear you out as an Indigenous person, and they recognize that your culture and your past really means a lot. So I just wanted to leave that with everyone, and thanks very much for considering it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Councillor Follis. Any further discussion, questions, amendments? No, seeing none. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you. So, folks, moving on to our next point, we have announcements. Would anyone like to start us off with announcements other than that the Toronto Raptors won the NBA and the Cup, which is pretty exciting. So, and I know we've got a wonderful finger up here, which is great. Toronto Raptors. So thank you so much to the Raptors for representing Canada, but I will open the floor for other announcements. Councillor Follis.
Thanks. I was going to say, building on that, I should borrow the finger. Just reference to our ward meeting coming up. The Ward 3 meeting happening tomorrow, Rotary Place, starting at 7:30, going to 9:30, and everyone's welcome. One thing I wanted to mention, we encourage everyone to try to keep heckles to a minimum as best as possible. But of course, that's sometimes, always part of it. The other thing I wanted to mention on top of that is we'll, in addition to municipal issues, we're also taking questions on the Raptors game and on Game of Thrones theories. So I leave you with that and hopefully see everyone tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Councillor Follis, and we're always happy to entertain Game of Thrones questions. That is for sure in Ward 3. So I actually don't know whose this is. Someone on council says it's Rob's, and he got it for $40, I think, at the Raptors one. So if you want to get me a gift sometime, feel free to get me one of those so I can point at people who are making announcements. Councillor Lauer. No? Any other announcements? Seeing none, we will move on to our open public forum. Do we have anyone out in the audience who would like to address council? Not seeing a big rush, but feel free if you ever want to. There's always an opportunity at council committee as well as council. And do we have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Councillor Spola, seconded robustly by Councillor Lauer. And all those in favor? And that carries. Thank you so much.